Welcome. I'm Dr. Vinay Prasad. I'm a hematologist oncologist, and I'm Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. In my professional life, I see patients, I teach trainees, and I do research in healthcare policy. This is Plenary Session. Plenary Session is a podcast at the intersection of medicine, oncology, and health policy, and you're listening to Season 3. On this week's episode. This week on Plenary Session, you're in for a real treat. I've got 3 guests this week who are going to talk about a range of issues. First, I have Professor Leah Litman. Leah Litman is Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. She's a former clerk for Justice Anthony Kennedy. She's going to talk about something that we have broached on this podcast but have not delved into head-on. We've talked a lot about Norman Wang and whether or not the retribution he faced was commensurate with his crime of writing that paper. And I still feel that there are some issues with the process of how he was treated. But along the way, we've been detoured from the bigger question, which is, what is the legal question of affirmative action? What is the law currently? Which direction is the law going? And why the direction the law is going may be flawed. Professor Litman is a thoughtful constitutional law scholar who's going to take us through this argument. This is a very important discussion. It's important not to forget how a debate could have occurred on this issue instead of being derailed by the process of how this person was treated in response to his views. And listen to Professor Litman describe how law professors with views very similar to Mr. Norman Wang are treated in the legal profession. You won't want to miss that discussion. Next, we can't forget this is still an oncology podcast, and God willing, we will be back to oncology in the future. And along that theme, we have Patrick DeMartino. Pat DeMartino is a pediatric HemeOnc fellow at OHSU, came to me a couple years ago looking for a project. I gave him an idea. It was just a scrap of an idea. I gave him that idea. He ran with it. He made the idea much more complicated and rich, to my dismay, because I don't like when people complicate things, but it turned out to be really wonderful, really spectacular. He submitted it to JAMA Internal Medicine, was accepted. It's been published. It came out this week on Monday. This is a paper on the potential cost implications of all drugs in 2018. What do I mean by that? Prior to 2018, we know the U.S. is spending $50 billion on all cancer drugs as of 2017. How much would it cost to pay for just the drugs that received marketing authorization in 2018? That was the task I gave Pat DeMartino. He took it and ran with it, figured out a whole bunch of other stuff, and he has found a very provocative number that can only mean one of 3 things. You won't want to miss this discussion. And last, I'm joined in the studio by John Mandrola. John Mandrola was once riding high, a Twitter star, someone whose blogs drew massive readership. But in recent weeks, he's been ratioed 3 times. He's stepped on it. He's made errors in the social media world. Was it his fault? What did he say wrong? You won't want to miss this discussion with John Mandrola about the intersection of medicine, politics, and the line between advocacy and naked politicking. And you won't want to miss this discussion. And you won't want to miss the way in which he conceptualizes this issue. So, on this positive note, you've got 3 big interviews. We're going to go into the constitutional law world, where I don't know anything at all. We're going to come back to something I know a lot about, which is cancer drug pricing. And then we're going to go and talk about something that, well, it's easy to know a lot about because there's no empirical data to guide us. So you won't want to miss this week's episode. Stay tuned. And on a future episode, I'm back, and I've got so much in store for you. I got Vlad Kogan. He's back to talk schools. I got Scott Stern and Adam Sifu, and they got a new podcast coming out on clinical decision making. You're not going to want to miss that. I've got Karine Tawaji, and she's back to talk about Javelin 100. And I have Carrie Cruz Bueno, an economist who's going to take us through the economic data on whether online schools are comparable to in-person education. We've got so much good plenary session in store for you. You won't want to miss this podcast in the weeks to come. Stay tuned. You know, I have been meaning to do a monologue on some studies that have come out recently because we had the Beat AML study, and I'm going to get to it eventually. I'm going to be able to take you through some of what Beat AML showed. But before we get to Beat AML, I just want to prime you with the idea that if you do an uncontrolled study of molecular profiling in patients with AML, and you want to compare it to any other cohort, the key is how are you selecting your patients? If you are excluding patients who roll in with AML with white counts of a $150, who are hospitalized in the unit with respiratory distress, and who have to get treated right away, if you're not going to enroll those patients, you probably ought not compare your survival results to those patients. And this is going to be the crux of the issue with precision oncology. Precision oncology is always going to run these uncontrolled studies that compare people who are selected in one way that selects for, frankly, indolent biology, good substrate, good socioeconomics, and they're going to try to compare themselves to people with rip-roaring cancers who have to be treated right away, who are too sick to be consented, who are too sick to participate in these studies. And these kinds of comparisons are beyond useless. They serve no purpose. And so if you're going to do a study like this, and you're going to take hundreds and hundreds of people, and you're going to put them through some non-randomized ordeal to pair them with drugs, you gotta randomize. You gotta randomize. Randomized, it's only a 4-letter word on Twitter. It's not a problematic word in the real world. And we're gonna come back to Beat AML. We're gonna dive in and we're gonna talk about it. But essentially, you know where I'm going with this. Uncontrolled studies in cancer medicine are the silliest thing on earth. They almost never tell us anything of value. In one case, we had a parachute. It told us something of value. That was 20 years ago, and we haven't had any parachutes since then. And you know what? Parachutes don't grow on trees, and that's why you need randomization. You don't need uncontrolled studies. One more plug. I've got a paper out in Nature Reviews Clinical Oncology. It's with Rahul Banerjee, and it's called Pragmatic Trials with Pre-Specified Subgroups, What Oncologists Can Learn from COVID-19. And it makes a very simple argument. Right now, we have randomized trials that test idealized efficacy in populations that are not representative of cancer patients. We also have expanded access protocols that occasionally occur to give access to drugs to people who don't fit the stringent inclusion criteria, explicit and implicit, of randomized controlled trials. Recovery comes along and they show a path forward. In a single large pragmatic study, they randomized 15% of the population. They're able to test whether or not drugs work in the idealized cohorts and the cohorts that you think they might not work, all with pre-specified subgroups and enough power to power for interaction. And this is a lesson we think can apply in cancer medicine. We can run large pragmatic trials of novel drugs with enough power to tell that they work in young, healthy people who would typically be trial eligible, but perhaps that they might not work in older, frailer Americans that resemble the real world. You don't need expanded access. You don't need right to try. A single, simple, pragmatic randomized trial. You won't want to miss this paper. Check it out. It's in Nature Reviews Clinical Oncology. One other plug. I got a paper out in Annals of Oncology with Ryan Waters. It's called How Often Do Highly Promising Cancer Biology Discoveries Translate into Effective Treatments? Ryan went back into the past and he found claims of highly promising breakthroughs, treatments that were just around the corner in the basic science literature. And he followed them out with about 12 years of follow-up in the literature. And he asked how many of these cancer drugs that were prophesied as miracles that were definitely going to work, how many materialized with 12 years of follow-up? And the answer is, you're going to have to read the paper because you're going to have to read the paper. It's quite sobering. Ryan Waters, fantastic student at OHSU, has done a fantastic paper. It's out now in the Annals of Oncology. And one more plug. Paper, Kate Rosen. Kate Rosen is a star OHSU third-year student. And she came to us, myself and Emerson Chen, who is friend of the show. You know Emerson Chen. He's done a number of really interesting papers on the FDA approval process. And we decided to do a project where we would take advantage of one scrap of data sharing, one tiny morsel of data sharing, a little in the parentheses data point that came out in the Lancet journals, which was the number of patients censored at every time interval in Kaplan-Meier plots that appeared in the Lancet journals. This was a change that occurred in 2018. And this little change permitted an analysis of censored patients. Now, of course, censoring is something that happens in Kaplan-Meier plots, and the fundamental assumption of the Kaplan-Meier method is that censored patients are no healthier, wealthier, or wiser than those who are not censored. In other words, that the censored patients are uninformatively censored. They are equally likely to experience the event of interest had they been included, but of course they're not included because they're censored. That's the assumption. But that assumption might not be right. It might be wrong. If you give a drug that has real toxicity, it might preferentially weed out people who cannot bear that toxicity. They might be older, might be frailer, might be more likely to progress. That would be informative censoring. That would be really bad. And it would be really bad if there was differential censoring, more censoring in one arm than the other arm. Well, because the Lancet has given us this data, we're able to calculate the percent of people censored in each arm every time point, all the trials, last few years. You won't want to miss this paper. There are a number of remarkable findings. There is a trend that happens in censoring. It moves from one arm to the other arm over time. There's some reasons why that happens. And there are outliers. That's the big thing. There are some trials that stick out like a sore thumb. I'm looking at you, Quizartinib. And when you stick out like a sore thumb, there is something there that needs to be looked at. And it needs to be looked at very closely, if you catch my drift. And that's why that drug went to ODAC. And that's why the ODAC concluded the way they concluded. And that's why I don't see too much of that drug these days. So you want to take a look at this paper if you're someone interested in the Kaplan-Meier method and survival analysis, in the way in which censoring is happening all around us and you don't see. And if you are somebody out there who's listening to this podcast and you think, well, progression-free survival, it actually does matter, it is clinically meaningful, it is useful. If you like PFS and you think it matters and you don't know what censoring is and how it works and why it works a certain way in PFS that it don't work that way in OS, if you don't understand that, you really don't understand PFS a la trial PFS. You may understand what it means when your patient progresses, but you don't understand the construct that's being tested in the trial. So you're going to want to take a look at this paper. All right, those are some papers that just came out in the last week or two. Unlike a lot of people, when COVID hit, we didn't completely retool our agenda to do empty, meaningless COVID publications that weren't going to tell us anything of value. We stuck with what we're good at and we plowed ahead. And there are no regrets there because, frankly, 95% of COVID papers the world could be without. The vaccine, it's coming. That's going to be interesting. That's something that we needed. Calculations of IFR, got too hot to trot. RCTs, cluster RCTs, masks, got too hot to trot. Those are the kinds of things, randomized trials of therapeutics. That's what we really needed. A lot of this stuff that I read, we don't need that. One last plug. One last plug in the week's news is long COVID. Long COVID, which are people who've previously had COVID, although some long COVID sufferers are actually PCR negative and antibody negative. Yet they present with the symptoms of long COVID, which are a number of diverse constellation of symptoms that are attributed to having had COVID. It's a very thorny space, and I have to tread lightly. And I thought about every word. I thought about every last word, and I wrote an op-ed called More Science, Less Speculation on COVID Long Haulers. And what the article talks about is two things. One, people who are suffering. We need to figure out what helps them suffer less, what makes them feel better. That's true. Two, what is the cause of why they're suffering? If something happens to you bad after having COVID, was it due to having COVID? If something happens bad to you after having a COVID vaccine, was it due to the vaccine? It's a very difficult issue. Methodologically, it's not so clear. And we have an added problem, which is that Twitter is amplifying the voices of quote-unquote experts who do not appear to understand what it would mean to inject science into the space of long COVID. And thus, they are fueling a lot of powerful narratives around long COVID that may not have the empirical data behind it, and they do not seem to appreciate what they're doing. Of course, they're playing to the crowd. Once you get into the 100K club, you gotta play to the crowd. And what playing to the crowd means is you gotta talk extremely politically, and you gotta talk about things like this. It can be problematic if you forget your roots, and the roots are science. So I encourage people to read my article that's out in MedPage today called More Science, Less Speculation on COVID Long Haulers. We need more trials, more clarity, and not just for treatment. So you won't want to miss that. On that positive note, we're going to talk to Professor Litman on affirmative action. Stay tuned. I'm back in plenary session, joined via Zoom by Professor Leah Litman. Professor Litman is a legal scholar. She's a legal expert, and she is one of the 4 hosts of Strict Scrutiny, which is my favorite legal podcast. Although I don't know that much about the law, but I'm learning. I learn a lot from the podcast, and it's a terrific podcast about constitutional law that I think you should check out. Professor Litman, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess I should give listeners a little bit of background about you. I know you are an assistant professor at Michigan, and you completed law school there. And afterwards, you clerked for some important people, including Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court. And you and Dan Epps, did you overlap as clerking for Justice Kennedy?
No, we didn't overlap, although he was part of the class of clerks who interviewed me when I was interviewing for the position.
I see. So I guess for people in medicine, I guess clerking for a Supreme Court justice is a real honor, and it gives you sort of a very unique perspective, I think, in how the court works and how the court thinks. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
a lot of the rules that the court operates by aren't super public, and so you don't get the opportunity to understand things like how opinions are assigned or different conventions that the court has unless you work there or practice there pretty regularly.
I see. And I've learned a lot about sort of the court lore through the two podcasts you've played a role in, getting sort of a behind the scenes look. And I'd always been sort of an amateur person interested in this, reading the Jeffrey Toobin books, although I shouldn't say his name these days. And then, of course, learning a lot more from the podcast, which has really been sort of a rare opportunity for people not in the field to learn about it. But I guess I'll just jump into what I wanted to talk to you about today, because I know our time is limited. But I was really grateful for your time, because I'm wondering if you might explain an issue that has arisen in medicine recently. We've talked about it a lot, in part because of this one paper written by this one professor. But I think people have missed the bigger picture, which is the issue itself. And that's the issue of affirmative action in the admissions processes of universities. And my understanding is that there is an ongoing legal question. And actually today we got some information from the Harvard suit. And the legal question has to do with the Civil Rights Amendment, specifically Section 7. Maybe I'm saying that wrong, but which forbids employment-based discrimination on the basis of race. And the legal dispute is, what does that mean? Was that meant to mean that we cannot preferentially consider people from underrepresented minorities or not? That's the question. I wonder if you might explain, what is the legal question at stake here when people say the Supreme Court ruled on affirmative action? What are they arguing about?
Absolutely. So before I get into that, I think it's helpful just to get on the table that there are actually many different kinds of affirmative action. We're going to be talking primarily, it sounds like, affirmative action in the context of education. But of course, there's affirmative action in employment as well as other fields as well. But even within education, there are different kinds of affirmative action. So sometimes an affirmative action program might look like a school says, we're going to reserve 5, 10, 15 spaces in our class of 100 for so-called underrepresented minorities. Other times, an affirmative action program might look like, well, we're not going to reserve certain spots in the class for underrepresented minorities. Instead, we are going to consider race together with other aspects of an application that might contribute to diversity in an educational class. Another variation on this might be, well, we're going to assign a number of points to an individual based on any number of characteristics that they have. 5 points if they're above our 75% LSAT or MCAT score, 5 points if their GPA is above a median, and perhaps 5 points if they're an underrepresented minority. So what all of those programs have in common is they involve some consideration of race when determining whether to admit an applicant to an educational institution. And the question is, does that consideration of race, which is not done to disadvantage a racial minority and isn't done in order to subordinate one racial group to another, is that nonetheless impermissible under the many different laws and the constitutional provision that governs the use of race? So under the Constitution, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution prohibits states from denying persons equal protection of law. And the court has held that when states differentiate between people on the basis of race, that triggers the closest, most intrusive kind of judicial review in courts. So most considerations of race are subject to what we in the law call strict scrutiny.
Hence your podcast name.
Right, exactly, yes. Our podcast name. Yeah. And then there's a bunch of other statutes that govern more specific kinds of consideration of race. So there's Title VII, which, as you noted, governs employment. There's Title VI, which governs education.
I see.
And there's just a bunch of different statutes that govern when race is permissible, under what context. But the general question in all of these cases is, when does consideration of race amount to prohibited discrimination on the basis of race? I see.
So just to be clear, the legal dispute is not should universities do this. It's are they prohibited from doing this? And that's a key difference, because I think some people understand this to be like the Supreme Court is telling universities what to do. Universities choose people in all sorts of multifaceted ways. Just the other day, I was, people are like the particular model organism somebody worked on in their laboratory. That's something that they like. And so they might give that person a preference in their selection. It's not about what we're telling universities to do. It's what universities are prohibited by law from thinking about. One factor among many. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. It's whether the Constitution permits them to consider issues of race, or statutes permits them to consider issues of race, not whether it requires them to do so.
And is there a link here between the receipt of federal dollars and this? So if a university is completely cut off from all federal money, can they do whatever they want, or are they still governed by these rules? Is the money somehow play a role?
There's a bunch of different federal statutes, and one of those federal statutes conditions the receipt of federal funds on the condition that an educational institution not discriminate on the basis of race. But then there are other statutes that just flat out prohibit discrimination on the basis of race. So there's a bunch of different overlapping statutes. Some involve receipt of money and some don't.
I see. One thing that I've always been puzzled with as an external observer is that, I don't know a lot of history, but I would understand that the Civil Rights Amendment to the Constitution, that was intended to correct long-standing discrimination against some ethnic and racial groups, particularly Black Americans, particularly the long and stained legacy of slavery in this country. That is it considered ironic that to some degree that legislation is now being brought forward as a reason not to give not to give consideration to the unique experience of these individuals and factor that into selection processes? Is that something that's discussed?
Yes, that's definitely one part of the debate about whether affirmative action amounts to discrimination on the basis of race. Because, as you were suggesting, one key purpose behind the Reconstruction Amendments, of which the 14th Amendment is just one, was to free, former slaves and racial minorities from the conditions that subordinated them. And so there's something odd about turning around and saying, well, also, those amendments prohibit measures that are in part designed to help
to ameliorate
groups.
Those wrongdoings, right? So then,
exactly.
Then why, when I look at the way the court has split on this issue, it looks like those people who, they call themselves originalists, and I can only assume whatever that means, how they interpret, they go in the mind of, somebody who lived in 1700 and think about how they thought of it. But why do they not see it this way, that the purpose of it was not to be used in this other way, ergo we should not enforce the law in this way? How have they spun it the other direction?
So I think what they say is kind of twofold. First, they read the purpose of the amendments to prohibit considerations of race, and they say what the amendments were designed to do was to dismantle separate but equal regimes that treated people differently on the basis of race. So they just define the purpose at a different level of generality, instead of saying its purpose was to help the conditions of racial minorities and ameliorate the conditions that subordinated them. They say, no, the purpose was to eliminate considerations of race. And so that's one way that they kind of get around, the opposing argument about the purpose of the amendment.
I see. That's how they play that. Okay. So my understanding from following the court, which had been leaning one direction, probably right of center, and now is leaning heavily right, is that the court is moving against maybe not today, maybe not in the near future, but sometime perhaps in the near future, the court may take actions that make it much more difficult for places like Harvard and Yale and University of Michigan and Texas to consider race among other factors. I wonder if you might articulate where the court has fallen. My understanding is they do not permit quotas, but they do permit it as a factor currently. So where have they fallen currently? Where might they go? And then the next part of the question, which we can come to in a little bit, is why might you or somebody who thinks the way you think argue that this is the wrong direction to be taking the law?
So the current state of play, at least with respect to affirmative action programs in higher education, is something like the following. Institutions of higher education can pursue consideration of race for the purpose of ensuring a diverse educational experience. They cannot, however, justify consideration of race on the basis of remedying or responding to previous societal discrimination. The only circumstance in which they can use race in order to respond to previous discrimination is if they themselves had formal discrimination on the basis of race.
The
by
applicant
law.
themselves. The applicant, I see. Okay.
No, the institution.
Oh, the institution.
Yeah,
okay.
so the only way that the institution can say, we will consider race when deciding whether to admit an applicant is if we as an institution previously discriminated against racial minorities, and therefore we are adopting this admissions policy in order to rectify our previous discrimination.
But isn't that true for every university? Because at one point in time, they didn't admit people of color.
Well, the second requirement that the court has imposed on institutions of higher education is what we call in law narrow tailoring. There has to be a close fit between the goal that a university is pursuing and the means it has adopted to pursue that goal. So that's why, for example, the court has said quotas are never permissible.
I see.
Because a university can never prove that they need to set aside 10, 5, 12, or 25 spots in the class in order to remedy past discrimination or ensure adequate diversity in the class. And because they're unable to prove that, they can't have a quota. But what the court has allowed for is universities may consider race together with other aspects of diversity in order to achieve a diverse educational environment. The court has said that's something that universities can pursue, and they can pursue that by consideration of race as long as they first think about whether there are ways to achieve a diverse educational body that don't involve consideration of race. So that's where the state of the law is right now.
I see. Are you worried that it's going to move in a more restrictive way on universities to further curtail the ability of universities to use race among other factors just based on the Coney Barrett confirmation and the way the court has moved?
It is absolutely going to be moving in a more restrictive direction, and the only question is when. It was going to be moving in a more restrictive direction when Justice Kavanaugh was appointed to replace Justice Kennedy. And it's certainly going to be moving in a more restrictive direction now that Justice Barrett has replaced Justice Ginsburg. You mentioned earlier that the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, which is the court that sits just below the U.S. Supreme Court in the federal court system, they upheld Harvard's affirmative action admissions policy. And their conclusion was that under governing Supreme Court precedent, as it stands today, this policy is clearly legal. But the U.S. Supreme Court isn't as bound by governing Supreme Court precedent since they can revisit their cases. And it's very possible that the challengers will ask the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case and change the law on when universities are allowed to consider race in admissions.
I see. And I think they talk a big game about adhering to precedent, but when push comes to shove, they're more than happy to throw precedent right under the bus. What's been working well for decades doesn't need to stay. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about, let's say you were a justice on the Supreme Court. My understanding from having followed you a little bit, although I've never heard you sort of explicitly state, is that, how do you think this law ought to be interpreted? How would you advise your fellow court members, and how would you vote? I guess for me, it seems a strange sort of compromise we're in, that we can't actually explicitly say we want this many seats, but we can, in a sense, achieve that purpose. And just thinking about the broader purpose and intent of these laws and what they were meant to do, and now what they're being used to do. How do you come in on this? What do you think is sort of the better way to interpret this law?
Yeah, so I think about it along three different axes. One is, I think that the evidence about what the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction Amendments meant when they were enacted is quite compelling. It's not just that I think the people that ratified the 14th Amendment had in mind the purpose of dismantling racial hierarchies and racial subordination. What's equally persuasive to me is the fact that that Congress that ratified, they adopted the 14th Amendment, then passed a bunch of statutes that specifically awarded benefits not only to former slaves, but also to persons they described in the law as Black or colored. Mm-hmm. So they did not think that the 14th Amendment prohibited race-conscious laws that were designed to improve the material conditions for racial minorities. And I think that that is very compelling evidence about how we should interpret the Constitution and the statutes passed in order to codify, that prohibition against discrimination. Mm-hmm. So the evidence about how the Reconstruction Congress interpreted those amendments suggests that universities have the option about considering race if they are doing so in a way that is designed to foster inclusivity and equity rather than subordination.
Mm-hmm. I see. And that to me is just very sensible on the face of it. And maybe I'm the wrong person to talk to because I see things your way. But I guess one of the things I've heard, because I listen to some of these right-leaning legal thinkers, and one of the things I hear them say is that you don't need race. In fact, if we banned you from considering race, you can achieve the same outcome by using income. And I guess I've always wondered, I was like, well, one, I was like, is that even empirically the case? But two, is it, is that really what what the law was intended to mean, to tie their hands in this way and not use race, and then find some surrogate for race that goes hand in hand with race, which is sort of proof that race is still a powerful determinant of socioeconomic factors, and that race still has this huge burden, being born the wrong color is still, not as good as being born a different color in this country. Is that really what the law is about? What are your thoughts on this idea, using money instead of race?
Yeah, so I guess I would say two things about that. One is, and I think this is something that Justice Souter mentioned in his dissent in Gratz, which is one of the affirmative action cases, is that there's actually some value to asking institutions of higher education and other governing institutions to be transparent about what it is they're trying to do. Why force them to bury their rationale, as you were saying, pretend it's somehow about income and socioeconomic status, when what they're really trying to do is in order to rectify previous racial discrimination. So I think that there's value in allowing transparency and honesty in what governing institutions are trying to do. But second, and more importantly, is I think that overlooks something that affirmative action programs and race-conscious remedies are trying to do, which is acknowledge the continuing relevance of race in the United States. When we look at, for example, statistics about the coronavirus, we see race is still relevant in health outcomes, access to health care and health insurance. It's still relevant in housing. It's still relevant in employment. It's relevant in how much you make. It's relevant in how you're treated by the police. And so what those programs can't achieve is rectifying for problems that are at least correlated with race. And they also can't include people specifically because their experiences in their lives have been shaped by racialization and, their race and how people perceive their race. And so I think that, efforts to treat socioeconomic status and income as a way of achieving diversity is important for one kind of diversity in socioeconomic status, but doesn't capture the other kind of diversity and the other kinds of harms that affirmative action programs are designed to remedy and include.
I see. That's very nicely stated. I'm wondering if you might address the question around Asian Americans and some of the litigation around Asian Americans, where I think my lay summary of it would be that Asians feel like that they are having opportunities deprived despite the fact they're coming in with very high test scores and often exceeding other groups. What are your thoughts on this particular part of the affirmative action question?
So that's a question that is at issue in the Harvard litigation, and it may be in some other litigation as well. But I actually think that is separate from questions about the permissibility of affirmative action. And the reason why I say that is as follows. If any of these institutions are purposefully capping the number of applicants they admit because they are Asian American, that is illegal, whether or not they have an affirmative action program. Because even under any of the legal theories that say you can use consideration of race in order to remedy prior discrimination or to foster inclusivity and equity, none of those theories say you can exclude members of certain racial groups because you don't want them there.
I see.
Like, that is illegal discrimination, even under theories that say institutions of higher education can consider race when they admit applicants.
I see. That's a very important distinction that I had not fully appreciated. I'm wondering if you might comment a little bit about the disconnect between, I think one of the reasons people have a hard time processing this is that people approach this question with the mindset of how ought universities admit students. But the legal question is all about how ought they be prohibited from, I wonder if you might get into that a little bit. That is it possible that there are two progressive, thoughtful institutions that both use some affirmative action policy slightly differently? And is it the role of the law to decide from on high how we ought to select people for something that, to be frank, is really, at the end of the day, a very subjective thing we do is picking people for medical school. I don't know about law school, but I would imagine to the same degree. How do you think about this distinction about, are people free to select in ways that, you get my picture, yeah.
Yeah, so I think about it in terms of not only academic freedom, as you were suggesting, the ability of institutions to think about how exactly they want to run their business and what would make for the best academic environment in which to learn and to teach. But also in terms of what is the proper role for courts in a democratic society. And I don't believe courts should be ruling out of bounds or putting off the table different approaches that governing institutions can pursue in good faith, particularly those that are aimed at inclusivity. And, when the court says universities can adopt affirmative action policies, universities have not adopted all of the same affirmative action policies.
I see.
Some schools have a program like Harvard that is just a holistic application across the board that considers all factors at every stage of the inquiry. Other schools, like the University of Texas, have a combination of a top 10% plan where they admit students who graduate in the top 10% of their classes at Texas schools, and then also admit some number of students based on a holistic assessment of their files. Other universities will say, we want some students who are going to be really focused on music, or we want to admit a class of students that is going to pursue different interests. And there's no one right way to do admissions. And so what the court's affirmative action decisions have done is to say, well, when you're deciding what kind of admissions policy you want, you can consider race in some ways. And what the court seems poised to do is to say, no, you can never consider race, at least explicitly or out in the open.
I see. That is a very interesting point. Does the court permit a university to consider race in a way that perpetuates majorities? So are they allowed to give a point to a white person instead of a black person? Or does it have to be an underrepresented component to it or historical injustice component? How does the court deal with that question?
So I think under what the current law is, which is universities can consider race in order to ensure a diverse educational environment, no university could walk into court and say, well, we're giving a point to white applicants because white applicants don't exactly make up a minority share of university pools. And so there wouldn't be a justifiable basis for saying in order to achieve educational diversity, we need to admit more white applicants.
I see.
Just given the representational pool of most universities right now.
I see. But in a theoretical world where 90% of schools are people of color, and if then a university could potentially have such a program, it just has to do with the proportionality currently at the moment. Is that right?
So under the court's existing precedent, which is universities can consider race in order to achieve a diverse educational environment, that could well be the case. When affirmative action was initially litigated, however, the original rationale and justification was we should be able to have affirmative action programs in order to remedy past societal discrimination and past histories of discrimination. So if that's the rationale that becomes accepted for why universities can have affirmative action, then that wouldn't justify giving a plus factor to white applicants.
Even if they were the minority group in the school. I see. Right. That makes a lot of sense. What about the question of, one thing I come to is this sort of, I don't know, it's this concept that people toss out, which is the best the best applicant. And when people say best applicant, they're like, we just need the best applicant. It doesn't matter what, that's the thinking. And when I hear that, I ask, what do you mean best? Best by what? And I can speak more to my field, which is medicine. So I was like, well, we have a standardized test, the MCAT. It has nothing to do with being a doctor. I don't know what it has to do with, but it is a standardized test like every other standardized test. There may even be a racial bias that's been hard baked into this test based on the way in which it asks questions and the types of people and the types of upbringing that lead one to read and answer those questions the way the test maker has intended. And it's never been validated against an external thing like people who score well on this test are great doctors 10 years down the road. It's validated against other tests. So people who promote this kind of best applicant narrative, they say, well, the MCAT predicts graduation. And I say, well, one of the things to graduate is passing a standardized test that is almost identical to that standardized test, right? So, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, it's going to predict who graduates if you make the hurdle to graduate the exact same thing as the test itself. Similarly, college grades. I guess I'm not necessarily convinced that people who score really well on those metrics do well. Similarly, we use other things like how many papers have you published, how many times have you worked in a lab, and all these things. And these can, they speak a lot to the ability for the applicants' parents to get them connected to the right people. And I know that because now I'm a faculty and, people who are well connected seek me out disproportionately to people who are not as well connected. So I guess one of the things I wonder if that enters into the thinking here is that the way we consider this idea that there is a scale of merit, that an absolute meritorious scale, that is a fundamentally untrue, unsound concept, in my opinion. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think of it, I guess I would rephrase it in terms of merit is a pretty capacious term, whether you're thinking about college applications or the field I know, law. That includes a bunch of skills that are not reflected in or very imperfectly reflected in grade point averages and standardized test scores. One thing that lawyers need to do is be able to talk with people and make their clients comfortable and develop human relationships in order to build clients. I don't think that's something that a standardized test score is going to measure. And so if the question is, well, we want to admit people who are going to be good lawyers, well, it's in some ways more important to think about what's their emotional intelligence or what's their personal rapport and ability to build connections and have empathy, to other people. What's that like? And similarly, for college applications, markets change and, some people go on to do amazing things because they were super creative,
right?
Or, they saw something changing and they just seized on that. And I don't really think that's something that is going to be measured by a standardized test score either. And so given that grades and standardized test scores are going to measure something that is surely relevant to one aspect of college or one aspect of law school, yes, we should consider them, but that can't be the whole story. And so to say that you are taking away spots that people are entitled to because of their grades and because of their standardized test scores ignores, I think, a very important reality that what we're trying to select for are people who are going to be, productive citizens and help society or be good lawyers. And those aren't skills that are going to be super well reflected or perfectly well reflected in GPAs and standardized test scores.
I see. One question that somebody asked me, and I guess I don't know the answer, but I'm going to ask you, and I don't know if it's a tricky question, which is, among the pool of people who self-identify as Black or African Americans, there may be people with diverse historical and life experience. There may be descendants of slaves. There may also be a group of children of immigrants. My own parents were immigrants from India, but there could be, a lot of friends who are children of Nigerian immigrants or Ghana immigrants. And I also have a friend who's just a African-American descendant of slave. And he has always, asked me, and I've wondered about the way affirmative action considers, Black, which is a very broad category. How is it permitted to think about these sorts of historical, path distinctions and the rich and different experiences different people bring from both paths? How does affirmative action think about, or can think about that, under the law and just broadly? Yeah.
So one objection that people sometimes have to affirmative action is that it sorts people into government imposed racial categories when those categories are imperfect and don't capture diversity. I think a rejoinder to that is nothing prevents a school from asking for additional information. So, for example, you identify as Black. Well, tell us a little bit more. Are you a first generation student? Are you descended from slaves? Are you from the Deep South? Are you from elsewhere? And so nothing is preventing schools from trying to collect more information unless you say, well, schools can't ask about race or consider race at all.
I see. Interesting. Now, I'm wondering if you might tackle this question, which is that it is often the political right and Republicans who simultaneously champion individual and institutional freedoms to experiment, to try different things and to see what succeeds and what fails. And yet and they oppose judicial tyranny, judicial rules governing us all. And yet in this instance, it seems the roles have reversed because it is they who seek the judiciary to tell Harvard, which really, how did Harvard decide they wanted to do this? They had to win hearts and minds for decades. They had to win the faculty's hearts and minds and say, we want to prioritize a diverse class and get people to believe that that's a virtue. That is the hard, thorny problem of political processes. And now the political right wants the judiciary to come in and enforce. Isn't that sort of the inversion of the way in which they portray themselves as sort of permitting freedom and that sort of thing?
I think that's why claims of judicial activism or judicial tyranny are oftentimes too general to be helpful in answering whether any particular dispute should be decided a particular way. Because the reality is both conservatives and both liberals think that sometimes courts should rule certain courses of action off the table. And the entire dispute boils down to, well, what kinds of things should courts say are impermissible? And here, Republican appointed justices think it's okay for courts to say, institutions can never consider race, whereas progressives say, no, institutions should have the ability to decide for themselves whether to consider issues of race, and they can vary from one another in that respect. And it's not courts' role to tell educational institutions how they should be doing their jobs.
I see. And that's the sort of irony that I keep noticing is that when it works to your favor, you're very happy to get the court to do the hard work, which is that you can't do by changing people's minds and getting them to see this differently. I wonder if I'll ask you about one more thing, and then I want to ask you about another topic, but I'm very curious about. I don't know if you had a chance to look at this article by Norman Wang I sent you. Did you have a chance?
I didn't have a chance to look at it super in depth.
I guess, but I will just say that it's an interesting article to me because it's written by a doctor. He's a practicing doctor, and he's a professor. And this is not a subject that doctors often write about. In fact, they usually don't write about it, don't comment about it. He wrote an article and he published it in a cardiology journal, and he tried to go through the history of the law. And as far as I can tell, I think he summarized it fairly accurately. I think he's really sort of sees the way the court has ruled in this way. I think he was a little bit critical of the current law, and I think he sort of is more in sort of a John Roberts tradition that he wants to take the court in a direction where we truly make it impermissible to consider this, and that any consideration of race is itself discrimination based on race. That's the way he saw it. Now, I guess he got a lot of the thing that made it messy was that when he wrote this, and of course medicine, especially at institutes of higher education, is a very left-leaning, progressive thinking kind of business, and he got a lot of trouble, and he ended up being demoted and had his paper retracted. And I thought that was a little heavy-handed because I thought that he actually falls into kind of there are people on his side, even if we don't, sympathize with what he has to say. But my question is about, I guess, the law school. I mean, there are left-leaning legal thinkers and scholars like yourself, who you actually clerked for, sort of a centrist or, right of center judge with Kennedy. There are people who, are maybe more to the left of you, and there are people on the conservative side of legal thinking. How does the law school, handle the issue of, having freedom for faculty members to argue in their direction while simultaneously preserving a culture of legal school that is inclusive and doesn't make people feel picked on or intimidated? How do you all negotiate this? And how do you tolerate differences of opinions in a legal school?
So law schools have a pretty strong, robust understanding about academic freedom. And I think the general tenor is, you are allowed to explore arguments in your scholarship and commentary, within your field of expertise. And again, as a general matter, that is not usually going to make you unfit to teach in the classroom.
I see.
That being said, in the classroom and in dealing with students, there is also the expectation that you treat everyone with respect and that make sure everyone is welcome in the classroom. But I do think that academic writings are often treated as separate from your ability to maintain a inclusive, welcoming classroom environment, although obviously, there are going to be some difficult cases that blur the distinction between the two.
Yeah.
But I think that's generally how law schools try to approach that.
I see. Yeah, my worry, of course, is that sometimes being too heavy-handed with someone who is on the wrong side of history can backfire because it makes them come out as a victim and distracts from the issue of, what they were saying. So that's what I thought happened in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult balancing act between staking out positions that make sure everyone feels welcome and also signaling what positions are truly out of bounds. I wouldn't entertain arguments about why we should go back to a regime of slavery, right? Like that's not going to be an accepted argument, while also ensuring that you are, again, not doing something that would be counterproductive or backfire.
I want to ask you a question on a different topic, but since I have your time for like 10 more minutes, I thought I'd ask you this. This was something that I was reading, and maybe it's empirically not the case. Maybe it's legally problematic. But here's what I was reading. Obviously with this new Supreme Court, one of the central issues that's at risk is jurisprudence around Roe v. Wade and the downstream cases from that. And I think many liberals are concerned that this court, when Coney Barrett will, when given the opportunity, start to erode those laws and if she can, do away with Roe v. Wade. We had a couple of cases that you discussed very nicely in your podcast about the admitting privileges laws in Louisiana and Texas that are just cookie cutter laws that are meant to see if the court has the appetite to erode the abortion freedoms that the court has previously granted. One of the things I was reading was a legal scholar who, and I don't know if this was Posner or somebody else, but it was somebody in a pragmatic tradition who argued that they thought that Roe v. Wade actually didn't guarantee a lot. And this is what their argument was, which is that if you are a woman in one of these states, these red southern states, the realistic opportunity to have an abortion, if you so desire or need or in that situation, realistically, that has already very, very limited. They have done so many things to make it very unwelcome for people who do that work, to get that done, to have that safely. You have to travel often hundreds of miles. If you're poor, you may not even know it's available. There are people who try to hide that it's available from you, deceive you. So this person's point was that just as a practical matter, we think this law is so powerful, but realistically for a poor minority woman in the South having an abortion, the odds of that, if they want that, is far, far lower than that same person if they were plopped in the center of New York City. And then this person, I think this legal person was arguing that the political backlash from this it offsets the benefit that the law provides in an empirical way, irrespective of what the merits of the law are. You're somebody who thinks about this issue. You're very articulate and passionate about this issue. I wonder if you've thought about this. Is it just clearly not the case? That's not a true argument. Is there some truth to it? Does it really reveal that we need to go beyond Roe v. Wade and have additional things? How do we think about that question?
I think there is truth to it in that nothing about Roe versus Wade ensures reliable access for all women to abortions. The court, for example, has said that states can refuse to fund abortions under Medicaid programs and state-supported health insurance programs. So for poor women, access to abortion has always been much more difficult than for women with reliable access to, more protective health insurance. And even under Roe versus Wade, states can express a fair amount of disapprobation for abortion, just making it more difficult for women to obtain it. That being said, Roe does prevent states from limiting abortion more than they already do. So technically the governing law regarding abortion is no longer Roe versus Wade. It's Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I'll come back to that in a second. But, that law has prevented Texas from closing, 30 plus of the abortion clinics in the state. It prevented Louisiana from closing 2 out of the 3 in the state. It prevented Mississippi from closing its last remaining abortion clinic. So to say that it has no practical force whatsoever is, I think, not true. Okay. Although I agree it doesn't ensure access to abortion for all women. Okay. But the reality is that in its absence, abortion would become even harder for women to access and would therefore prevent more women from accessing abortion than the existing system does. Now, I'm also not sure whether overturning Roe would generate the kind of backlash that would ensure better protections for abortion. In Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the decision that I mentioned, the court said we're basically junking the legal test from Roe versus Wade and substituting a different standard that is much more permissive of abortion restrictions. The court effectively did the same thing last term in the case involving the Louisiana admitting privileges requirement. And there wasn't any kind of progressive backlash. There isn't progressive backlash when the court says states can refuse to fund abortion as part of Medicaid insurance programs. And so nothing the court has done thus far to make it easier for states to restrict abortion has generated the kind of backlash that people fantasize will happen if Roe is overturned. And so I think that is hoping for something that might not become reality. And the lesson might be that if you want to ensure access to abortion, you have to be working for that now and not expecting there's going to be some magical moment that will just galvanize the country to ensure, safe, reliable access to abortion.
I see. I'll ask you just one last question because I know our time is running out and it's late there. I guess my last question for you is, most people who listen to this are in medicine. And, the way we think about medicine is whenever we have disputes, there's always this thing we can appeal to, which is like, does this drug work in this situation? We're like, we'll just randomize 1,000 people and we'll know the answer, Some of us look at the law and, maybe this is mostly me. I worry that people can reason their way to whatever their preconceived notion was. And I particularly worry that with this right of center court that has, just such a knack for always finding the right argument that gets them right where they want to be. And it wasn't always this way. I mean, I think the justices weren't always just so tightly adherent to the political philosophy of a party. I guess my question is, how do you retain your hope, seeing a court 6-3 in this direction that's likely to move, I think, in a bad way on all these issues, from voting rights to abortion to affirmative action to things that progressives, tools that and potential to strike down any progressive law that gets passed in the near future, in a way, making it harder for democracy to move us in a progressive direction in society. And they're going to come up with whatever reason they want to do this. At least it looks like to me. How do you retain your optimism? How do you think, how are we going to make progress in this space? How do you think about that?
I'm not sure I have a ton of optimism about where the court and the courts are going to be going in the near future. What I do take some solace in, or I'm somewhat hopeful about, is, a majority of the country rejected Donald Trump. A majority of the country supports things like LGBT equality. A majority of the country supports women's access to reproductive health care. And I hope that majority of the country finds a way to win elections so they can actually implement those policies and ensure that the courts will not invalidate them. I don't know exactly how or when that's going to happen, but I take the increased political involvement that a lot of people had in the 2020 election, together with, more general measures of where public opinion is, as some reasons for hope.
Professor Litman, thank you so much for your time. This was really educational. I'm sorry you had to listen to me try to summarize the law. It's quite bad. I should stick to what I know, which is hematology, oncology. But I think it's really important, and I really appreciate you doing this because, people in medicine, they have strong feelings about it. And I think many of those feelings are perhaps right of center, I worry, in a lot of people. And I think it's because there's some misunderstandings about what exactly is the legal dispute, what exactly the law is, what exactly the purpose was, some of the things that you talked about so nicely. So I think it'll be a great benefit to this audience. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm back in plenary session, joined via Zoom by Dr. Patrick DeMartino. Dr. DeMartino is a pediatric hematologist oncologist at OHSU. He is a graduating fellow, and he is semi-entering the job market next year. We can talk about that. Dr. DeMartino, it's a pleasure to have you here on the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Just before I started recording, you were asking me about how I've had to shift gears and talk about COVID. What were you saying?
Yeah, it's... I would imagine a fair bit of your day is spent at least thinking or reading about these things. And for me, I try to be enlightened and aware, but it's just a black hole. There's just so much out there.
I was just lamenting it. I was like, oh, God, yeah, I have to spend, I am spending a fair chunk of my time reading about COVID and thinking about the policy. And not that that's really what I set out to do, but I feel like I'm kind of compelled to do it because, there's just so many things out there that I think are very simplified and incorrectly put, and just couldn't possibly be true. Like just today, that El País article, I see all these quote unquote COVID experts, these people who are, semi-health related, who tweet exclusively about COVID. They're tweeting this wonderful article and the graphics are stunning. It's just that all of the numbers in the article could not possibly be true. It's just got to be a crock of nonsense, because we have actual data of how often does virus spread between spouses and family members and household contacts. And then you read this thing about what would happen if you had a dinner party, what would happen if 5 people got together in a room, and it's not compatible with those numbers. And I see so many people tweeting it, and I think to myself, what's wrong? Have they not thought about it for 10 seconds before they tweet? I think that's the answer. They haven't thought about it even for 10 seconds. So anyway, so you see that. I get pulled into COVID. Now this podcast is all this COVID in schools and things like that. What a disaster, Patrick.
I think even for people that are the first percentile in terms of having the educational capacity to really interpret the stuff, it's just the opportunity cost of sitting down to think about it. Probably the average physician or master's of public health trained person doesn't have the time maybe I'm just an optimist.
No, I think
people the benefit of the doubt, but it's just a huge time suck.
It's a huge time suck. It is a huge time suck. I mean, it's not obviously there's tremendous problems that people are struggling with, but I think, it's a time suck. And a lot of people have had to put their real work on the back burner. I tried really hard not to do that. So the first few months of pandemic, I was full steam ahead on all the projects that I was working on. But lately, I think I have given up more of my time. It is an opportunity cost reading about this stuff. Someday COVID will end, and all this COVID knowledge is not going to be very relevant for anything I'm interested in talking about.
So hugely important for population health now.
Now, yeah. I can't watch them bungle anything more. Bungle. Okay, so I gave you just a snippet of an introduction. Let's talk about who you really are. You're a HemeOnc fellow at OHSU, and a few years ago, I think... you came to meet me, and you were interested in health policy and pediatric hematology oncology, which is a very different beast than adult HemeOnc, as you learned while you did this article. And then, I think we set out to do this project. It might have been, I don't know, 3 years ago, really. Yeah. You have a panicked look in your eyes thinking about how many years ago it was that we started. And we started working on this. By that, I mean, I talked to you and then you started working on this. And it's finally coming in print, and that's why you're here on the podcast. By the time we release this audio, it will already be in print, and it's going to be in JAMA Internal Medicine. Patrick, tell us the title of this paper, and then maybe give a little bit of the background. What is this paper titled?
The paper's titled Potential Cost Implications for All U.S. FDA Oncology Drug Approvals in 2018. And what we really sought out to do was to describe the potential costs associated with these drugs from a national perspective, while also, and maybe more importantly, thinking about what would be a plausible level of utilization of the drugs amongst eligible patients. And I think when we first met, this was kind of in the period where there was recognition that the growth of cancer drug spending was outpacing the vast majority of other realms in medicine. And that a greater proportion of the drug development pipeline is being devoted to cancer drugs. I think currently it's a little bit over a third of all drugs in development are cancer drugs. And as you've described, the market authorization, getting that FDA stamp of approval often is a huge financial return for companies, regardless of what the clinical benefit might be. And then right around when we first met, it was kind of in the wake of 2018 being this record year for total number of new entrants into the U.S. market, having received FDA approval. And I think that was probably the impetus for sort of your interest in thinking about, okay, doing the back of the envelope math, what would all these drugs cost if you gave them to everybody that's eligible? And that was really our first question, and sort of a hypothetical thing because you would never expect 100% diffusion or utilization of these drugs across all eligible patients. That was kind of our first question. If you give all the drugs to all the eligible patients in the U.S., what is the associated incremental cost for cancer drug spending?
Yeah, that's well put.
Then,
go on.
And then really just the second question would be, if you think about in the real world, there's discounting, nobody pays full price, and then there's variable market diffusion or uptake of these drugs. And how do those two sort of factors possibly influence spending? And specifically, what percentage of eligible patients can receive these new drugs while also kind of keeping national expenditures where we would expect them to be.
And that is, I think, the even more clever part of the paper that, I certainly never saw coming when we started. It was based on that simple premise that you allude to, which is, we know prior to this paper, we're spending, X billion dollars, and you can fill those in, X billion dollars on cancer drugs. And the paper had a simple question, which was, let's just take all the drugs in 2018 that were FDA approved. And it was a good year for marketing authorizations. Let's just take all those drugs and imagine we gave them to everybody in the U.S. who was eligible for those drugs, who was fit enough to get them, and let's say 100% market diffusion, cost isn't an issue. What would that cost be? And that displaces some other drugs, so that's built into this calculation. So I think one of the approvals you had was Echelon 1, which is AVD plus brentuximab, which is displacing ABVD bleomycin, so brentuximab displacing bleo. And everybody who's getting AAVD, Adcetris or brentuximab vedotin, instead of ABVD, they're paying for the brentuximab, and they're not paying for the they're not paying for the bleo. So you're going to say, what's the cost of the brentuximab minus the cost of the bleo? You're going to give them credit for that displacement. But some drugs are approved, and there is no displacement because we weren't giving any drug in that space. So, for instance, a drug in a maintenance setting where we didn't have maintenance before. I don't know all the examples from the top of my head, but there are many such examples where we used to observe someone until they progressed. Now we're filling that crack in the sidewalk with maintenance. That's the strategy to how you get the market share. So maintenance therapy there, that's not going to displace anything. So you're not subtracting in those situations. And so it was just a simple idea, which was, just roughly, what's all this going to cost if we really made it available? And if it turns out that healthcare cancer drug spending doesn't go up at the rate that we predict, that gap can only be explained by the factors you talk about. One, people aren't getting it. They don't have access to it. Two, people don't take it for as long. Or three, there's some discounting, some back-end deals that we're not privy to. Those are the three things there. But as you started working on this, I feel like you became a self-trained health economist. You started out, and I think you knew a little bit about health economics, but in the process, the 2 years that you worked on this, you read a lot more. And by the end of it, I was the one taking notes from you because you had a lot of things to teach me about market diffusion and things like that. Do you feel like that's a true summary of what you learned along the way?
Yeah, I mean, when we first met, I think I knew nothing about sort of healthcare finance, and really I was totally naive, and then just took me so long to go through 46 approvals and probably 100 plus pivotal studies that over that period I learned a lot of extra stuff along the way. And I read a lot of really random things, which I think helps.
And this is the takeaway message if someone's listening to this and they're not interested in the content, which is that one can learn things by reading things. That's still true in this world. It's a form of long distance learning. It's not Zoom. It's called a book. But anyway, you read a lot and you learned a lot of things. Okay, why don't we jump into the results a little bit? Because I think this is where it gets really interesting. There are many drugs approved in this time period. This 1 year of drug approvals, and you're a pediatric HemeOnc doctor, so for many of them, you had to learn the indication, the tumor, what we're doing. You learned all that, so you did half an adult oncology fellowship in the process. You're nodding, and you set about this calculation. So maybe before you tell us what you found, tell us what was cancer drug spending, the cumulative drug spending the year prior. And then how much would it cost if we paid for all these drugs? And then maybe tell us kind of how you ran that calculation.
So in 2017, in the U.S., we spent roughly $50 billion on cancer drugs as a whole. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't account for infusion costs or anything. It's just the drugs. And then we found we had 46 drugs included in our analysis. And if you gave those 46 drugs to everyone that was eligible, that would cost about $40 billion net cost. And that's having subtracted $7 billion saved on the displaced therapies.
So what you are suggesting is, in a hypothetical world where these drugs are broadly available, that we would almost double the spending on cancer drugs in a single year if we were to cover the drugs approved in the next year.
And that would represent a little over 1% increase in total health expenditures in the U.S.
But that's not possible.
Well, it's a pretty big.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a huge amount. That's a huge amount of increase, right?
Yeah. Great. Absolutely not possible. So I've done, like, I'm kind of interested in these, like, budget impact analyses. And this is always the crux of the issue, is trying to estimate what, like, a realistic level of diffusion would be. And without sort of industry proprietary data, that could be a really hard estimate to make. And that's kind of where the second piece of our paper comes in. Now, if you want to move on to that, or kind of hang out in the space of thinking about just the obscene net cost.
I guess maybe talk for a minute about the obscene cost and like how you actually had to do it. So, how did you go about this calculation? It couldn't have been easy. How did you go about doing it?
So let's say, first you identify the 46-ish approvals on the FDA website, and you take the indication, and then we needed to estimate what the eligible population would be in terms of size. And we used a 2019 U.S. population estimate. And we used a mix of American Cancer Society, SEER data, and a little bit of just peer-reviewed literature to fill in the gaps to estimate how many patients would be eligible for a given approval. And we used as sort of well-focused of an indication as we could, including molecular subtypes, et cetera. And then we arrived at a number. I think that the mean number of patients eligible for each drug was about 9,000, but the range was quite broad. And this was by far the most tedious task.
And tell us about that, because there's no master list of how many people are presenting with metastatic or advanced cancer. So one has to go about doing their best way of estimating that.
So we crafted a pretty obscenely long supplement, really detailing all of our estimates and references. And there were some methods that had been used previously, i.e. using for like incident presentation with metastatic disease. We used mortality data, which has been used before, I think in some of your papers. And that was probably one of the bigger assumptions that we made. But for most other things, I think that we got pretty good estimates, and we showed our work in excruciating detail.
Excruciating. That'll keep the piranhas away. Okay, so now tell us about the second part of it. So what you're saying is the first result was even accounting for displacement, which is interesting because, of course, displacement doesn't displace all that much because these are displacing older, cheaper drugs. And in some cases, they're not displacing anything at all. Even accounting for displacement, if we paid for all these drugs approved in a single year, we'd take the budget from $50 billion to, 90 billion or something like that. And we don't take the budget that high. We just simply do not do that. It doesn't go up that much year to year. If it did, there might be more of an impetus to actually deal with these costs, but it doesn't. So if it doesn't go up that much, there can only be one of three things going on. People don't take these drugs as long, which would lower the cumulative spending. People aren't getting these drugs at all, or there's a discount that we don't see. How do you go about thinking about those things, and how did you ultimately conclude what you think the market uptake might be?
Yeah. So thinking about all these drugs in aggregate, it's, I think, impossible to try to go about it sort of from the front side using those three pieces that you've mentioned, because they're such a heterogeneous group of drugs. So we sort of went and made kind of a backdoor method for estimating what a plausible degree of uptake would be for the drugs in aggregate. So we know that industry forecasting suggests that annual growth of cancer drug spending has been and will continue to be around 12 to 15% per year-on-year increase, which is about $7.5 billion per year in 2019, 2020. So we kind of know about how much incremental increase in cost there will be year to year. So we asked, like, what percentage of eligible patients can get these new drugs and keep the annual spending threshold increase below that $7.5 billion threshold. Importantly, that this ignores other things that contribute to that $7.5 billion year-on-year increase, like old drugs far outpace inflation in terms of their annual increase, or sort of shifting demographics also influence increasing expenditures. So we really kind of modeled the best case scenario, but long story short, if you give a little bit of discount, I think let's say a generous like 23% discount, which is sort of equivalent to the Medicaid best price guarantee. So you give a discount of 23%. Less than 25% of eligible patients can get the 2018 oncology drug approvals and keep that sort of stay under that $7.5 billion threshold.
I see.
Which I think was quite surprising.
So what do you think this means? I mean, what does that mean? I think there might be some truth in that. We do know there's sort of there's low market uptake.
So we know that many of the drugs are approved with less than impressive evidence of efficacy. I think just over a quarter of these drugs demonstrated any amount of improvement in overall survival.
Oh, I see. So what you're saying is they're home runs.
Some of them, a small number.
A small number.
But yeah,
a small number.
A pretty underwhelming number of these drugs are home runs.
Mm-hmm.
And the other interesting piece would be like, what if there was a new market entrant or drug class that was truly a home run, and there was demand for more than 25%? I think that is maybe the other interesting piece here. Could a new therapeutic class really disrupt things? But I think that you look at like the Hep C drugs, obviously a very different space, but there have been some issues with affordability and patient access. When you have a truly innovative, efficacious new therapeutic class, I think it's been shown that the price of these drugs is untenable if lots of people want them.
And I think that's what they're going for. So I guess your overall take is, this was a project that sought to highlight, I think, the fact that the prices are unsustainable. Let's imagine we have a really transformative therapy. So this is, I guess, where we're going with this. Really transformative, like the Hep C drugs. It actually cures everybody. It's a drug that, let's say you can give it to PS4, Don't say PS5. PS4! Let's say you can give it to PS4. If you can give it to PS4 or better, performance status 4 or higher, it's a really transformative drug. And let's say it costs what these cancer drugs cost. What's going to happen to the budget? What would happen if we had our own sofosbuvir? So
I think this is being addressed a little bit right now in the gene therapy space where people are really optimistic. And this is kind of where alternative reimbursement methodologies may be gaining some recognition. And I guess this did come up a little bit with like Kymriah CAR-T. So payers and industry recognized that $500,000 upfront was not consistent with sort of payers keeping their budget in check. Because for payers, it's really all about the short-term affordability. They have a time horizon of maybe 2, maybe 3 years where they need to keep their budget balanced. And so I think this is something that I'm interested in for other purposes, but the industry is starting to tout the promise of alternative reimbursement methodology to make things more affordable. And really all that does is defray the cost down the road. There's a new gene therapy that's approved in Europe for beta thal. Will likely be approved for sickle cell in the U.S. in the coming years. And they've offered in Germany a 5-year annuity payment, which lets payers pass the cost on to the population while keeping their budget balanced. So I would imagine that would be the route we would take in oncology as well.
I see. A 5-year annuity.
All hypothetical.
I see. I've heard people say, you take a mortgage on your house, let's take a mortgage on your life. I think to some degree it strikes us sort of as a fundamental un-American thing to do, that we would have to sort of leverage our future earnings against our healthcare now. But it seems like we might be going that way, I guess is what you're thinking. I don't know. What do you think about it? Do you think about it from an ethical point of view, or do you sort of just think about it agnostically from a numbers point of view? Yeah.
I think that if it gets people access to the drugs in the short term, that's important.
Okay.
Because if there is truly a transformative drug, I would want my patient to have access to it. So from kind of a physician taking care of patients perspective, I guess I'm agnostic. But I think the greater issue is sort of really a policy issue, and like, what do we value? And I think it's really complicated. I don't have a good answer. But I don't feel that annuity payments are going to be this magic answer. And same holds true, I think, for annuity payments with sort of outcome-based, like with the CAR-T therapy. If you didn't maintain, I think, a CR,
yes,
you basically got your money back.
Yes.
But,
if you didn't achieve a CR in 1 month, I think with tisagenlecleucel and pediatric ALL, you got your money back. But I guess the challenge with that was, they know their CR rate is like 77, 83. It's like 80%. So it's a very expensive process for you to document who's in CR in a month. And it will roughly translate to a 20% discount, which roughly would make tisagenlecleucel cost the same amount as Axicell,
yeah.
right? Yeah, which is $300,000, right? So it's like a lot of work. You know how sometimes you have to collect all these coupons to get a discount at the store. It's like a lot of work to just get the fixed discount. It made me think about that. But I guess what you're hinting at is sort of a really deep issue in this space, and I don't know if you have thought about it that much, but I thought a little bit about it. But I guess I'll also express some uncertainty here, which is that, these cancer drugs cost an arm and a leg. They cost a lot. And their rate of change of price is astonishing. They cost way more today than they did 10 years ago. And really, that's really what you're highlighting, is that they cost so much that just to pay for 1 year of approval would be ludicrous. I guess my question is, the open question in this space is, do these incredibly high costs sustain innovation? And they certainly, I think, fuel people pouring money in this space. Like you pointed out, 1 in 3 drugs in drug development are cancer drugs. That wouldn't be the case if people didn't know the regulatory hurdle is low, just response rate, and you get to market for the most part. And the profits are enormous, because even though that these are rather quote unquote rare diseases, the cost per unit is so high that they can still make a fortune. So that does encourage people, investing in the space and funding drug compounds. But is that the same as innovation? Are we getting more Gleevec, or are we getting more cabozantinibs? Are we getting more transformative drugs, or are we just getting a lot of regorafenibs and cabos and Me Too duplicative, next in class Pepsi drugs? I guess a few things you talked about hint at this. One, you said, what percent of the drugs in our data set improve survival, and how much survival do they improve? And I guess two, the question I would ask for you is the philosophical question of, if we paid less for these drugs, what are some of the ways that would impact the entire drug development pipeline? How would that affect this world? You have an uncertain look on your face, which is probably the honest look.
Yeah, some very pie in the sky questions. Yes. I agree that I definitely am interested in thinking about how to better incentivize the development of therapies that are going to most help people. Whereas I think our current system incentivizes development of therapies that will best help the bottom line of industry. And I think in some ways that is something that's great about our system, and it fuels lots of innovation, and we have lots of new drugs, but they're not necessarily the drugs that we need. I think that there's obviously lots in the news written about value-based payments, and I'm no expert on that, but I think that probably something in Germany, I think that their system probably is a little bit more apt at incentivizing companies to have new innovative therapies. Whereas if you're just developing Me Too drugs, which in the U.S. can be wonderfully lucrative, in other markets you're not necessarily going to have the same yield. So maybe that would be one approach.
And I think that's a smart way to look at it. I want to come back to something you wrote in the paper, which I'm just looking at now. So it'll be out November 9th. So this podcast should be November 9th-ish. It should be dropping. Here's what it says. This is your conclusion paragraph, which I think you wrote more than me, because I think you did a lot more than I did on this paper. Here's what it says. If widely used, the new cancer drugs approved by the FDA in 2018 would drastically increase cancer drug spending in the U.S. Alternatively, only low-level market diffusion of the new drugs allows for maintenance of budgetary trends. Industry forecasting suggests low-level uptake of the new drugs is most likely. While cancer drug pricing and expenditures deserve the attention received, the financial state of affairs would be far worse if newer approved therapies were more effective and used widely. The current drug pricing system is likely contingent on a sizable proportion of eligible patients not receiving the latest FDA-approved therapies. So that's a very provocative thing to say, that's really what the system depends on. Otherwise, it would break. But you think that that's true. I mean, there's no way around that conclusion when you look at the data the way you've looked at the data.
Yeah, I mean, you would have to expect that no one knows better than sort of manufacturers in projecting their sales. and their overhead costs and their needs from a revenue perspective. So you would expect that the drug prices are set, and it's contingent upon not a lot of people getting them because the drugs aren't all that great.
Yes. And I think there's some people out there who say things like, well, if we really had a curative drug, a transformative drug, you would just take it the one time and you'd be cured. And I was like, I don't think you study drug approval, because my friend, you would have maintenance curative therapy till forever. You would just keep taking it to maintain your CR. Why wouldn't you? Why would you ever stop taking it? That's really how we play things these days. We, of course, had IPI, where we gave a few doses. Then we had Nevo, where we just keep it on forever. So I think that would, I'm not necessarily sure that it would be a one and done kind of thing. It's a very interesting paper, Potential Cost Implications of All U.S. Food and Drug Administration Approvals in 2018. And I guess the person we didn't give a shout out to that we should give a shout out to is Milos, our second author. This paper is written by Patrick, who is the first and corresponding author, you, Milos, whose last name I'll never pronounce correctly, and me. So it was a 3-author paper, and Milos, I think, provided really important contributions on helping us think through some of the displacement and on getting us the important thing we needed, which is the price of these drugs, which is really not so easy to come by. And he's a terrific colleague of mine from the NCI, and actually one of the most really thoughtful oncologists who writes a blog that I believe is called Infinite Regress, which I really do like. But there are only 3 authors on this paper. So what's going on there, Patrick? There should be at least 15, 20 authors. Where are the other authors?
Maybe a medical writer. Unfortunately, I've yet to get my Boku Bucks grants, so I'm still writing my own papers. It was actually my first legitimate publication, so it was a great experience. But yeah, we were a lean crew.
A lean crew. We're efficient. We got it done. Oh, that's a great feeling. So it's like your first big paper. So that's good. That's good. Why don't you tell listeners in the last minute of our conversation? Why don't we just tell listeners about, I don't know if I should say this. Every once in a while, some student comes to me and says, should I do pediatric HemeOnc and adult HemeOnc? And I said, I can't answer that question for you, but I think one of the things you got to know you're getting into is you got to know the job market situation. So I would say talk to some peds HemeOnc fellows, because adult HemeOnc, for all the problems and challenges that we face, there is an abundance of jobs. I mean, academic jobs and private jobs and industry jobs or whatever. Pediatric HemeOnc market, my understanding is that the majority of that work is done in academic medical centers, and there just are not enough jobs for the people graduating. I wonder if you might talk for a minute about what was it like to be a peds HemeOnc doctor in the job hunt? Is it as tough as people say? And what do you advise somebody out there who says, I love oncology, I love hematology, and I love kids. I want to do it peds HemeOnc. Are you still a proponent of it?
Yeah. I will say that my experience in the last few months of sort of as a third-year fellow looking around the job market are occurring in a pretty unique time with COVID and hospitals really having to tighten their coffers a bit, but also kind of using some of the experience from my co-fellows in the past. I think that it is definitely a challenging market when you compare it to what adult HemeOnc fellows would experience or other pediatric subspecialists. Mm-hmm. I think within the peds subspecialist realm, we probably have one of the more competitive job markets. And one probably needs to be okay with being flexible, whether that's being flexible with what realm of peds HemeOnc you'll go into, whether it's heme, solid tumors, neuro, or flexible with from a geographic perspective. Right now, before I sort of fell into an opportunity, I kind of would have needed to be willing to go anywhere in the country to get a job. And I think for a lot of people that might not be the right thing. But if you can be flexible, I think it is doable. Conversely, if you want to become a pediatric rheumatologist, you could probably work anywhere in the world that you want.
Really? Is that true?
To have you. Yeah, I mean, things like peds pulm or peds rheum, the job market, they need more docs very badly.
And what about peds ID and peds endo?
ID, I'm not certain. I think endo also has a pretty good job market. And relative to peds HemeOnc, it's like night and day.
And what about peds cards?
I don't know about peds cards. Yeah, I'm not familiar. I don't interface with them enough.
I see. Yeah, I wrote an article recently about complaining about these extra fellowships because somebody was like, I've attended on transplant service when I worked at OHSU. I used to attend on that service on whatever they called it, red or whatever that. It's funny how you leave a hospital and then you forget you bury those memories of whatever they call these services is some silly name. But I attended on that service, and my experience at transplant is that I did I don't know, maybe 16 weeks over the course of my fellowship, like several months, because we had long transplant rotations, and I rotated on NCI and NHLBI, so I had kind of double dipped on transplant. And then of course, like anything in medicine, that when you graduate fellowship, you never know it all, and you actually never know it all, even when you practice, and you keep learning every single time you do it, and you keep getting better. So I did it, and now of course there's all these new fellowships, a BMT fellowship. I've seen myeloma fellowship, lymphoma fellowship. I have a difficult time being impartial because I know what's really going on. And what's really going on is it's a scam, man. It's a scam. Everyone knows it's a scam, that these hospitals want to keep people training forever because they're making money, especially on somebody who's an advanced trainee. Like, you can operate and basically do the work of a faculty member. And then now, of course, you're another year of fellowship. I have a colleague, he was telling me he did a phase 1 fellowship and they're asking him to stay on for a second year. I'm like, when will this end? People need to get jobs. At some point, they need to go and actually make some money, pay back the loans that they have taken. We can't just keep adding on fellowships. And this argument that, well, you didn't learn it all in the training, that's always going to be true. You could train until you die and you'd still, if you went into practice the year after, you wouldn't know it all. And the last thing I'd say is I think of that, you ever watch the documentary Jiro Dreams of Sushi? And there is Jiro's son, and he's like 60 years old, and they call him the apprentice to his father's sushi place. And then there's a moment where he looks wistfully into the camera, and he's like, someday I will be the head chef. I was like, this guy's face like he's almost Medicare eligible, and he's still an apprentice. And I was like, that's what we're gonna do in medicine. That's where we're headed. Okay, so thoughts on this? This excess training, this you could always keep training?
Within the last 3 days, I've talked with 2 sort of co-fellows from other institutions, sort of former co-residents, and both people told me they were thinking about subspecializing in sort of our realm to, quote, get their foot in the door. And both of them use that word, foot in the door. Yeah. And I think that for people that feel really probably desperate in a competitive job market, it is appealing to go to a new place and hope that fellowship will translate into a job. But I don't know how often it does translate into a job in the place of your dreams. But it is a lot of time and really lost income to be doing these sub fellowships. I've been lucky here at OHSU. My mentors have kind of encouraged me to do what I want, and there's no expectation that I do extra training. So I think I'm fortunate in that sense.
You're fortunate in that
sense.
But
it does feel like a bit of a black hole for some of my friends.
Yep. Well, on that positive note, we will direct readers to the paper now out, JAMA Internal Medicine. Thanks, Pat. Pleasure working with you, and hope to have you back on the podcast to talk about more oncology, health policy, and cost.
Yeah, thanks, Vinay. It's always great to chat.
I'm here in plenary session, joined via Zoom by Dr. John Mandrola. John Mandrola should need no introduction to this audience. He is a legend of social media. Well, a former legend. He's former legend, and he is a practicing electrophysiologist in Louisville, Kentucky. He is a very thoughtful physician and the brains behind the medical conservatism movement, which is a hard right fringe movement. Obviously, that's what the internet tells me, Dr. Mandrola. No, it actually has nothing to do with the political left or the political right. It has to do with slow medicine being prudent adoption of new practices. But that's easily misconstrued when nobody wants to read the paper. Dr. Mandrola, it's a pleasure to see you today. How are you?
I'm great, Vinay. Thanks for having me on.
I really, I've been looking forward to us chatting for a while. And boy, it's really the perfect time for us to have this conversation because we are on the heels of the election. I think the final call has not yet been made. And I think it's perfect timing for the sorts of themes that we're going to explore in this discussion. So thanks so much for doing this.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited to talk to you. Hopefully we won't get canceled.
Well, at least not me. You're on your own, Mandrola. Well, John Mandrola, you, I don't know if listeners know this about you, but you're a nice person. You're a really nice person. And I feel the need to state that publicly because you've been called a lot of names recently on Twitter. You've stepped in it a few times, Mandrola.
Yes, that's true.
Why don't we talk about that a little bit? So correct me if I say anything wrong, but I think one of the first things you said that got you on the bad side of #MedTwitter was you sort of voiced the opinion that physicians should actually, no, you retweeted an article by I forget the author of it, but it was an article that
Sally Sattel.
Yeah, Sally Sattel. And I think the theme of the article was really that doctors should be wary of involving themselves in political issues or something of that sort. I wonder if you might summarize how you view the theme of the article, and then I'll tell the listeners what the feedback you got was.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I mean, I'm a practicing physician, and I love medicine, and I love what we do, and I feel passionate about helping people. I mean, it's just a really beautiful job that we have. And what I guess my feeling about politics and policy in medicine is that doctors are really, we spend a lot of time taking care of patients. It's not rocket science, but it's not easy either. I mean, you really have to work at it. And I think we can do a lot of good in the world by really focusing on helping our patients and when they're ill and take care of them. And what I guess have a problem with is that we're experts in that, but we're not really experts in policy. And I guess the example I would use is that if I have a African American patient with kidney disease and hypertension, and that person lives in a disadvantaged neighborhood, I know that the social determinants of health are important for that person. I recognize it. I take it into consideration in caring for that person. But because I know that doesn't give me any sort of expertise on the best way to fix it. Maybe like Bernie Sanders' way is better. Maybe, a conservative way is better. Maybe Elizabeth Warren. I don't know. I'm a doctor taking care of that person. And so we can have feelings as a person, but how could a group of doctors like the AMA or the ACC or any organization speak for all of us in terms of the right policy solution? And I think we just get over our skis when we think that there's one best answer. And I guess that's the thrust. That's the thrust of the article, the thrust of my feeling. And I guess the only thing I would add quickly is that, one of the reasons why I write about critical appraisal and about medicine and doctoring is that we really could be better at it.
Of course, yeah. A lot of room to improve, yeah.
There's a lot of room to improve, myself included. And, I've done a lot of dumb things. And I just,
Fragility index.
We interact with what's that?
I said fragility index.
Yeah. That's a minor, the fragility index thing is a minor flub. But I mean, if we just practice being better at what we do, we can make the world a better place. And we can advocate on our own time. But I just don't know how one group of doctors can speak for all groups of doctors.
So I think that is an accurate summary of what you were trying to say. And I think that there's some distinctions here that people are missing. One distinction is you are not opposed to any citizen voicing their constitutional power to say that I believe in X, Y, or Z. You support that. You're not opposed to medicine acknowledging that social determinants of health play profound importance. In fact, maybe even be more important than a lot of what we do. In fact, you've written so much about that that's part of people who follow your writing. You should know that you've written a lot about that, about the sort of long-term, atrial fibrillation, just for example, how you could try to cure it with a catheter, or you could cure it with, a society that gives people proper nutrition and exercise, that's something you're passionate about. So, I mean, you believe that, of course, these illnesses are driven by social and economic problems. What you're saying is actually is something in between, which is that if a doctor wants to wear the doctor card, the badge of a doctor, then they're fine to say that this badge entitles me to tell you that, lisinopril is good for high blood pressure. But the badge is not the right badge that gives you extra knowledge to say that I believe a single-payer healthcare system is the best system, or I believe that we should have a public option in a marketplace. That's another version of the problem. The badge doesn't help you answer that question. And in fact, if you're perfectly honest, you didn't learn shit in medical school that actually helps you answer that question. That's a very tricky policy question. You want to answer that question properly from a policy, you got to study. You got to learn some new skills. And it's not a doctor badge you need to hold. You got to hold a policy person badge, right?
Right.
So,
right. Exactly. Go ahead.
No, I guess that was what the article, I think, was meant to convey. The sense that if one wishes to use the doctor credential, one should realize that sometimes that credential does not give you special insight in political processes. And yet, to someone who doesn't know better, it's like the classic sort of joke, the doctor at the dinner party. You go to a dinner party and there's one doctor there. That doctor happens to know everything about English language and literature. They have to know everything about television and movies, and they're the political expert. Because doctors, it's just sort of the persona of a doctor that I know better than you in every discipline, which is not true, of course. And that was what you were trying to convey.
Right. I mean, I guess the other example is if let's say I was struck by these social determinants of health, which I am, and I'm bothered by it, and I go to Frankfort, the capital of Kentucky, and I talk to my congressman, and I say, hey, or congresswoman, I say, look, we really got to do something about this poverty in this part of the city. It's just tearing people up. There's higher incidence of heart disease, kidney disease, all this business. And the politician would be like, yeah, okay, doc, I sort of know that. What other ideas do you have? And well, there I think we can have a debate, and I think reasonable people can make arguments for any different kinds of policy solutions. But I don't really think there is one that a medical doctor should ascribe to. I mean, I just don't.
I think I personally like the example of, let's say we decide that the political goal is to provide healthcare for everybody that's affordable. That's the political goal. I actually think politicians should run on political goals, and they shouldn't run on policies, because frankly, they don't know shit about how to get things done, actually, and they're not experts in that. So they say the political goal is I want everyone to have healthcare, and I want it to have access to healthcare and have it be affordable. That's the goal. Then the answer is, well, what's the best way to get there? And one answer is Medicare for all. And Medicare for all has advantages. It would lower the percentage of money as percent spent on administrative costs. But it also has disadvantages. One of the major disadvantages is if there is a fraction of people in a society that is dissatisfied with their health care, not because of what they're getting, but because we know there's some people, no matter what you do, they're not going to be well. They're going to be, they're going to be sick because, we can't cure everything. And so there's going to be a fraction of people dissatisfied. If you had a single payer system and there was really no private insurance, then they would take out all their anger on the single payer. They couldn't switch. They would feel frustrated, and they would feel like they were living in sort of maybe even a tyrannical place. So that's a disadvantage. The other policy way would be a public option where you can buy into it. That would have many of the advantages. It would also stimulate competition, but you could also switch out of it. And that might make people feel better, the people who are not going to be satisfied. Anyway, I actually don't know the answer to the question. It's a policy question. It's an empirical question. It's not a question of values. It's not a question you study in medical school. It's an empirical question that we should all have a bit more humility about. And I think that one of the challenges is that when we confuse political goals with policies to get us there, I think that's a problem not just in medicine, but also in politics. I think that you see politicians running on, how to get you there. And some of those things are wrong. They actually don't get you there. In fact, some of them take you the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And the irony of this whole, brouhaha is that I'm completely for a universal healthcare system.
I know you are.
I've written articles. I've written articles about, like, my personal views are that we should build more parks rather than cath labs. And
Yes.
I think the way our American healthcare system is it's really a moral, it's immoral. I just hate the way there's inequity in our system. And, I visited Canadian EP labs. I visited hospitals in Scotland, the NHS, and I really lean strongly towards a Canadian or UK system. I've been to Poland, and their system is very similar. It's cost constrained. But the thing of it is those are hard policy questions that require a nuanced discussion about trade-offs.
Yes.
I mean, you and your colleagues' cancer drugs. I mean, how would they work in a cost constrained system? I mean, there would be trade-offs.
There'd be trade-offs. Yeah, I think there'd be trade-offs. I think that actually, well, we could talk about that for a long time, but I mean, I think the entire marketplace would be put on its head, and actually the whole pipeline will be reversed. But one of the things that you got in response to your position, and I guess the other thing is, I mean, I maybe there's some people who can eloquently argue why they would disagree with you and why they think medicine should be more political. Perhaps, I think that's fair to say. There could be such a person who would argue with you, and I think you would have been happy to argue, and you did argue, I think, with some people who argue in good faith. But some people went a bit beyond. They said that you appear to be a white man. I don't know for sure, John, but you appear that way to me. And you're from Kentucky. And so they said you're a white supremacist, actually. I saw that you may not have even seen it. You don't look through all the hate. I don't know. I guess that troubles me a little bit. It troubles me that even if one were to disagree with you, that one would feel no hesitation in calling you potentially one of the worst things you could call somebody. For the record, you're not a white supremacist. Is that fair to say, Dr. John Mandrola?
No.
Not.
Yes, I will disown that. That is not representative.
It is an inaccurate characterization of John
I am
Mandrola.
a white male, and I just can't do anything about it. Gosh darn it.
Yeah, right. You can't do anything about it. But you certainly do not espouse any beliefs. In fact, you probably are in staunch opposition to anybody who would espouse any such beliefs, and that's consistent with everything you've ever said and ever done in your entire life. And yet, on Twitter, people would call, it's astonishing to me. They don't know you. They'll call you that. There's another example. You tweeted something, and I actually forget what it was, but somebody called you total embarrassment. I don't know to who you're actually embarrassing. Maybe your spouse, I don't know, but you would be a total embarrassment. And they called you some other tough names. I guess I'm wondering, is it okay to call you these things because you're a white man? I mean, are people going a little harder on you on social media? That, I don't think they would say it about me because I'm not a white man. But people have called me names too. I guess I wonder what makes somebody comfortable with calling somebody such a thing.
Yeah,
thoughts?
It's a couple comments. One is that I look at Twitter as, and I even started my podcast today with it, that I really don't think social media is a good representative sample. It's almost like just a skewed sample. And I just think it brings out the worst in people. I like to think that if those people were in my hospital, if we were working together and they called me up for a consult, or we were taking care of patients together, that we would get on fine. And there's just something about this medium that allows that. The second comment is, as a writer, if you're not getting called an embarrassment or an abomination, I don't think you're doing it right. I mean, that's how I really got some traction. I wrote for a couple years and didn't really get much traction. And then I wrote about how the Iron Man might not be heart healthy. And the Iron Man community just called me a total abomination and embarrassment. And then, I was struck by it. But now, I mean. And
what was the argument there? It's because it's too much exertion,
Yeah, because there's some observational, some observational data that shows that
like a J-shaped
excess
curve.
exercise can actually, right. Yeah. So I was struck by it, and again, it's very similar to now. I wrote about it not because I have an agenda or because I have an answer. I'm struck by things that are curious and nuanced. And, I've been in medicine 24 years. And so if you do AF ablation and all you're doing is isolating pulmonary veins, life gets a little boring. So you're always looking for nuanced, interesting things. And that's topics like that interest me. So I don't really take it personally that someone calls me an embarrassment. I've learned to, I think it's just a good thing to ignore and consider it not a representative sample. And I will engage with people who are arguing in good faith because it's worth it to a point.
Yeah, I agree. And I've seen you do that. And I guess I say now I remember why you were called an embarrassment. It was because you took the view that doing a study, one of the things people who don't wear masks say, one of the many things they say, is that it will lower your O2 sat. They also say you'll retain CO2. They also say, a million things. And then they did a study to show that it did not lower your O2 sat. But of course, this required real people, real work, real effort. It was published in JAMA. I would say that, and you and I both felt similar. This was a stupid project, a stupid question. You can't fight crazy. You can't fight crazy with science. They're crazy people. They're going to say crazy things till the end of time. We cannot find every crazy thing some crazy person says and debunk it with a scientific study. Because you know what? We got shit to do. We have an agenda to run. We have real problems in our field. We can't go find the craziest person amongst us and have them set the research agenda. And that's all you said. And you were labeled a total embarrassment for pointing out that we live in a world with finite amount of energy and we can't fight the craziest person. We got to work on the problems we really have.
Yeah, it's exactly the same as how I got in trouble for the social determinants. I'm totally thinking social determinants are important, and I feel the same way about masks. I'm like, masks are fine. We should be wearing them. It's not a hill to die on. It's fine. But my problem is that when we try and browbeat people with false empiricism, it just comes back to bite us in the butt. Don't use something that's just a crappy, worthless study to try and influence people, because then when something really important comes out, you'll want people to have trust in your adjudication, your impartiality. And when you just publish that mask study, I don't want the authors to be mad at me and it, I'm not personally attacking them. I understand why they did it, but, JAMA is going to have to publish some important work. And when they have that, it clearly shows that they have an agenda that they want to, persuade people to wear masks. The right way to persuade people to wear masks is just to try and persuade them on the grounds of the precautionary principle, not that it's going to change your O2 sat. Come on.
I think that was a total failure. And the other thing you're alluding to that I think was a total failure was that study that I talk about in this week's monologue, which should be coming out just minutes from now. I said, it was like the y-axis was like the percent of people who know someone who had COVID, and the x-axis was like the percent of mask use in your state, and each dot was a state, and there's like a regression line, and then like Atul Gawande and Topol and all these people are tweeting it. And I was like, the moment you tweet that, everybody who actually does research has got to wonder if you understand research, because that is the worst data I've ever seen in my life. And if it was the exact same graph that said hydroxychloroquine works, you wouldn't have tweeted it. So what you're really saying is that your ability to interpret data is so broken, or you're willing to accept garbage data that supports your policy view and try to bamboozle people. I mean, either one is a deeply unflattering portrait. So I don't understand why anyone who can want to look at themselves in the mirror would tweet that garbage, but they did.
Yeah, I really, you've kind of taught me this. I was struck one time by, I got on this tact of using scary stories to help make my case. And it's pretty effective, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Scary stories are great for persuasion. But then I heard you, I can't remember if it was a podcast or a written article or whatever, you just kind of said that that's not the way we should persuade, because that just is we should be above that. We should be more empirical than that. So I think it's similar to these what Bobby Ye calls howler studies. I mean, the howler studies are counterproductive because they lessen our I guess our stance as judges and experts. And look, lack of trust in science is complicated and multifactorial. But I really think that having a political agenda and publishing things that are really not very good studies because they fit a narrative is just crushing.
It's
us.
poison. It's poison. And I totally agree with that, because if you believe in science and you want to persuade people, you got to use the best data. And it's just so natural, of course, to use the worst anecdote. I have a bunch of bad anecdotes. I keep them to my damn self, and I try to win the case on the data. But here's what I'm getting to. The reason I had this prelude. Here's my thesis. I would say that my view of the situation would suggest to me that the current incumbent president is perhaps the worst president we've had in the history of the republic. He's a guy who's mismanaged a pandemic, cost trillions of dollars in the economy, cost hundreds of thousands of lives through mismanagement. He's somebody who's separated kids from parents and put them in cages, and they can't even find the parents, which I think is a human rights violation. Potentially the sort of thing should be in the International Criminal Court. He's the kind of person who's done, I don't even know where to start. I mean, on every policy front, it's the worst thing you could imagine. And we ran this guy against him, this guy who's a pretty decent guy. And it should have been a blowout. It should have been 400 electoral votes. It should have been a huge blowout, but it's not a blowout. It's Friday, and they're still counting, and it's on the razor's edge. We've lost seats in the House. We're probably not going to go hold the Senate. And in this country, if you really don't have all those three, your agenda is deeply limited. I want to draw a line between a couple of things. Why didn't the Democrats do better? And I wonder if it's somehow a little bit related to some of the things that you have been cautioning about, which is that if you want to go around and call John Mandrola a white supremacist for having a point of view that is, maybe different than your point of view, but I think a perfectly reasonable point of view, a point of view that we ought to engage with. If you want to call John Mandrola, Universal Healthcare John Mandrola, a total embarrassment for pointing out that maybe we shouldn't have done a different research study, you're gonna drive a lot of people away. You're gonna make a lot of people not like what you're selling, because you seem like a really intolerant person who's not willing to have a discussion with someone who may think differently. And the people who are doing that are also every other tweeting, vote for Biden. Wear a mask, you idiot. Vote for Biden. Trump is bad. I said that I disagree with politics here, but I almost never tweet about the guy. I don't want to tweet about him. I don't think I've ever tweeted support Joe Biden. I mean, you and I, our feeds don't include naked politics. So if you want to create a Twitter feed and the whole feed is going to be Biden, vote for Biden. If you vote for Trump, you're a racist. Mandrola, Mandrola, if he says that a doctor should become a Biden supporter, good. But if Mandrola says a doctor should keep politics a little bit away from medicine, he's a white supremacist. If you want to polarize the world in this way, then don't be surprised when at the end of the day, nobody wants to be in your tent, even though you're running against the worst guy in the history of the Republic. Thoughts?
Yeah, I have many thoughts. I mean, I agree. I agree that Donald Trump is he's a con man and he's shyster and he's terrible.
And those are the good qualities.
and it's just, what he's done to destroy norms and to enhance the polarization is just terrible. The irony of me being attacked is at work, a couple of my partners call me the liberal because
you are a liberal to some degree.
I voted for Obama because I thought he was the next JFK, and I voted for Clinton, and I mean, yeah. So I just look, my view of America is pretty old fashioned. I really think that we're great because we're the United States, and the United States does, it's not just the coast, and it's not just us people in academia who know the right words to speak. I mean, there are kind and generous and wonderful people in flyover country. These are the patients that I take care of. And, that's, I don't know, is it 48%, 45% of the people? It's a lot of people. And that it was this close really speaks to something that the Democrats are not doing. And I guess
are doing.
Or are doing.
Yeah.
I mean, one quick story. When I was growing up in northern Connecticut, my grandfather, he worked in factories all his life. He worked in Royal Typewriter, and he worked in Colt Firearms, and he would always fight with my dad. My dad was a Republican, and back in those days, the Democrats were for the working people. They were they were for the factory workers. And now it really seems like the Democrats take for granted. I mean, they've sort of abandoned that and become these coastal elites and really illiberal. And I know the right can be illiberal too. I know that. I mean, but the illiberalism in the left really bothers me because they should know better.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess it's what they don't do, and some of the scary things about, if you're calling, these anti-racist thing. If you're not an anti-racist, you're a racist. Well, then what are you going to call real racism? I mean, that's the problem, because it's very complicated, but I hope that what I hope that happens is that and I'm optimistic, seriously, that this is going to calm down. That I'm kind of hoping for a mixed government, so that there has to be compromise, because I think that's what the founding fathers wanted. That's what's made America so successful. But even if there isn't, there'll be another election in 2 years, and the people can speak, and that's how it's supposed to work.
I guess I applaud your optimism. That's for one. I, like you, am more concerned with the illiberalism amongst left-leaning scholars, particularly in places of higher education, where you ought to be exposed to ideas that make you squirm in your seat so you can create the mental fortitude to figure out how to take someone who holds such an idea and show them why they're wrong. That's a skill. And if you're not willing to be uncomfortable with the idea, you will never learn how to take someone who holds it strongly and get them to flip their thinking. And every paper I've done, maybe not every tweet, because like everyone else, I'm subject to the same passions and I can tweet in the heat of the moment, but every paper I've ever done that seeks to advance a way of thinking around a topic has always aimed for the swing voter. I'm always thinking, look, I believe in, I see reversals every day, but these people, they don't see it. How can I show them that? So I try to do this for frequency reversal. I think these cancer drugs don't work so good, but they seem to think they're great. Well, am I crazy or are they crazy? Well, then I try to do pen paper, say like, well, look at all the drugs. Look how, they're not so good. And then sometimes, every once in a while, you win. You don't even know you win. Because I think that the genomic cancer drugs are overrated. And so I publish a paper saying that, turns out it only helps 8% of people. And the people who used to argue with me and say that they help everybody, now they come back and say, 8%? Yeah, we always said it was 8%. We never said it was any higher, right? But I persuaded them, right? I've persuaded them so deeply, they forgot what they used to say. Well, that's a win I'll take the win. Okay. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is this is just a tiny slice of life, which is the space that, you and I have spent a lot of time in, medical practices and drug approval. And in this space, a good skill to have is to empathize with someone who disagrees and think about what piece of data you can provide to flip their mind. This is true for every sort of issue, for every issue that we face as a society. Instead, what I view as the problem with illiberalism is it doesn't seek to do that. Instead, it seeks by brute force to get them to shut up. You can get them to shut up because you can make a very hostile climate for them to say their point of view, but you don't change their mind. And when they go to the ballot box, boom, 69 million people are throwing that ballot in your face and you're going to have a heart attack, as we saw. When I was critical of that PNAS study, you remember this, I got myself into, I got some private advice to lay off it.
Which one was that? Remind me.
This was the study that, I guess first I would say, like my point of view on the issue, I believe that there is a profound injustice towards the Black community that is rooted in slavery and Jim Crow laws that perpetuated even decades after. And our society has not yet done enough to correct that prior injustice. So I believe that very strongly. And I think that it ought to be addressed through sort of economic policy. This paper was published in the PNAS, and it claimed that a Black neonate in Florida has a much higher rate of death than a white neonate. And that is just an absolute fact. That's an absolute fact, and is a sequela of these, hundreds of years of inequity. It's a sequela of all that. And the paper showed that if a white doctor took care of the Black baby at a certain rate of demise, and if a Black doctor took care of it, that rate was reduced by some unbelievable proportion that cannot possibly be true. And then the more you pull at that paper, you realize that they didn't code the way the data is coded is a disaster. The attribution to doctor doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
It's thoroughly... I'm going to have to shy away from how I would describe the paper, but I believe there are a number of limitations to the paper for the conclusion. And, in fact, if you are someone who holds my point of view that the legacy of slavery has this inertia that we have not yet overcome, this paper is a disservice to the cause. It's a disservice because it suggests that 40% of all that bad stuff that happened can be undone if the patient looks in the face of the doctor and sees a Black face. It suggests that can undo 40% of all that damage. That is a disservice to the extent of the damage, if you ask me. Okay, so I think it's a paper that, one, is scientifically inaccurate, which is my number one objection. Two, it's a disservice to the cause, and they don't even, people who should be championing progressive values, as I do, I'm a progressive, they don't want to acknowledge that. Anyway, so then I pointed out that the paper has limitations, and of course I got a great deal of pushback. And I think somebody sent me a tweet where I think somebody was talking about me, and they called me a white-aligned person of color, POC. I'm a white-aligned. You're a supremacist. I'm merely white-aligned. I don't even know what that means because I don't view the world, I treat people the same. I treat people the same with a lot of respect, whether what country they're from, who they love, and how they look. I treat them the same. And so I found it really deeply hurtful. It's also personal. I'm talking about a paper in a technical way, and you want to make it about me and what I look like. And then I think the people who will do that, you will destroy the left. You will destroy the left. I'm the one who's saving the left because I'm the one who's willing to tell you that this paper doesn't prove what you think. All right, Mandrola, what do you say?
Oh, come on. That first of all, I didn't know what journal that paper was published in, but your take on that paper really... It influenced me, I would say two ways. One is, I think the most important thing you said in that podcast about that paper is you don't need to make this empirical. It's the same thing as the masks. You don't need an empirical argument for diversity. Diversity is good in and of itself. It's to try and use some really flawed, terrible science. I mean, come on. It's just crazy how bad that paper was. The confounders and all that business. And anybody who's in the hospital knows that one doctor doesn't influence somebody's care.
Exactly.
Okay.
I know.
But none of that's the point. The point is that diversity is good in and of itself.
Right.
And to use this false empiricism is just it's like you say, it's poisonous and it's terrible. And as far as discussing it, you persuaded me, and young people need people with more armor to like you say, armor to express these views because people are afraid. And so I mean, I just think it's kind of our role as I don't know, I'm not hardly an intellectual, but as a public thinker, it's our role to take on these difficult things. You did it with the Norman Wang paper. I mean, I think that's a classic example of where the progressive-minded people hurt themselves because, Norman Wang made an argument that many people consider, and some African American people consider that argument. And then as soon as it gets discovered, it's canceled and he's called a racist. Well, I don't know Norman Wang from Adam, but I mean, we can't do that. That defeats the cause. It hurts the cause. So I just think that we have to have these conversations, and if people push back, okay, we have to take it.
He's called a racist. His papers retracted in violation of any norm I'm familiar with. He's no longer EP fellowship director, and I hear he's not allowed to work with trainees because he creates an unsafe work environment.
You know, and that this is another irony that I'm even scared to talk to you about this. But you know, I've written before and I've discussed on my podcast that I strongly believe that we need to have more minority people in medicine, if nothing else, as mentors. I mean, look at what's happening with women in medicine. Women have more women mentors, and we're going to have more women doctors. Half my cardiology, not half, but 45% are women because there's mentorship. So it's a good thing to have more people of color in medicine. But how to get there, again, how to get there is an argument we can have, and we ought to be able to have without being called a racist.
I actually, and the irony is the whole thing is like, I really disagree with Norman Wang, and I'm going to get a legal scholar. She's from University of Michigan, and she's really sharp. And I'm bringing her on because I think she's going to be a really good and eloquent spokesperson for why the legal case that the Civil Rights Amendment prevents institutions that receive federal money from considering race in this way to compensate for past injustice is wrong, that it does not in fact preclude that, and that universities should be free to do that. So I'm gonna bring her on because I think she'll articulate it better than I could. But we have shifted the entire discussion from the merits of what he was saying to whether or not he should be treated this way. And that it doesn't help the cause either. It's a distraction. It's a distraction from the discussion to make it about him. I don't want to talk about him. Just let him be and tell me what's wrong with his paper. That would have been a better strategy.
Oh, it would have been a wonderful strategy if they could have published just a rebuttal of a line by line or paragraph by paragraph rebuttal of his points and come to a different conclusion. We could have had a extreme learning experience. Okay, another example. Look at RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Anton Scalia. They see everything opposite, but yet they're best of friends. Yeah. And I've listened to videos and lectures from them. Their different takes on things is it's so educational. And if we had this, we can advance the cause. And it's such a lost opportunity to say, to retract it. It's just way too big of a hammer.
You live in Kentucky. I was born in Ohio, just outside of Cleveland, and I have lived in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. Those are the states I've lived in. And I know all the people there, and I will tell you that, 50% of them are not racist, I think. I do not believe that they are. There are some people who are, and I've encountered a bit of it in my life, and my father encountered some, and my mother encountered some too. But it's not the majority. It's a tiny fraction of people, and I don't think we help anything if you want to say that 50% of people in those states are racist. I think you abuse the term to the point it has lost its value. I also think that this sort of persistent call I hear that we ought to abolish the Electoral College or something. I'm like, okay, well, you know what? There are certainly some benefits to having a direct popular vote. But you know what? That's not the way the system is. For 200 years, it hasn't been that way. And one of the reasons it wasn't that way is that the founders were concerned that there could be one single place on this country, this big country, that would be very, very populous. And that place could decide what happens everywhere else in the whole country. So a giant California could rule the whole country. And that would feel a lot like being ruled by England, a place that's very far away from where you are. And so a compromise was struck where there's some balance that disperses power based on the geography of the land. Is it perfect? Who knows? But this is the way the world is. This is the rules of the game. So I want to hear less talk of changing the rules of the game and more talk about how you can take all the people in these states that Obama won and get them to vote for you again. It's not that hard. You have to have the right message. And I think that if the message is going to be that Dr. John Mandrola is a white supremacist, I don't think that's going to go over so well. If the message is, we know you're hurting economically and we have policies, we have ideas to help you get food on the table and get to work because we know the value and virtue of work, I think you got a better shot. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, America's not perfect. We are definitely a flawed country, and we have plenty of flaws, but it's been working for a long time. And I feel funny speaking about the Electoral College because I'm not really a history or political science person, but it's like in medicine, something's been working pretty well for a long time. I mean, it seems wise to not change it, or unless you have really strong evidence. The other thing I guess I would say is, if you want to change the Electoral College, persuade the people that that's the right way. I mean, and it's persuasion. It's not just, by brute power. I really think that would be a problem. But I also agree that the Electoral College has its imperfections for sure.
Yeah. I mean, no system is perfect. I mean, even in a place like India, Modi basically controls everything with 32% of the vote. Every system has a compromise. There's not a perfect political system. I just think that it's
I don't know. Canada seems, every time I go to Canada, it seems pretty perfect.
Harmonious.
Like the people are, well behaved and seem happy. And I guess, I don't know, maybe it's just, yeah. So I'm really in awe of Canada. I love America, don't get me wrong, but yeah. Canadians seem very well adjusted.
Well, I'm always jealous of them a little bit, especially when I go visit. But I guess I feel a certain loyalty to this country, and I think it has all the potential it once had. It can be regained, and these elections don't have to go this way. We've been talking about these issues, which I think are so interesting. When I look on Twitter, I see every day I see tweets that I want to put a sticker note on, say, this is not how you do it. Not how you do it. So some examples. Mask saves lives. If you don't wear masks, you're killing people. Dummy. You idiot. How stupid are you that you don't wear a mask? The science says, mask saves, science says. Oh, like that, the cluster randomized trial that showed that for SARS-CoV-2, in a world with SARS-CoV-2, there was that cluster randomized trial in Europe, which randomized counties, and it found that masks reduce the risk of transmission by absolute risk reduction of 0.012%. That study. Oh, there's no such study. Okay, there's no such study. Yeah, there's no such study. Why don't we just acknowledge there's just not that perfect study? That said, it's a reasonable thing to do. I think the better messaging would have just been, if you want to get back to work, just wear this and shut up and we can get back to work. We can get back to getting the engine of the economy going. That would have been a better message. I think another better message would be stop whining. Just wear it. It's not a big deal. It's just not a big deal. Let's not make it a big deal. Let's not talk about it. Just do it. But that's not the message. The message is, what was the message? The message is, the original message was, when Fauci was on 60 Minutes, was don't wear a mask. You could touch your face too much and it will negate the benefit. But then just a little bit later, the message switched. It switched, obviously, that was the wrong message. And we were, of course, only saying that because we wanted to conserve masks. That's why we said it. But we said it rather convincingly if you watch the video. But okay, fine. All right. It was just to conserve the mask. Then the new message is that my mask protects you. It doesn't protect me. Of course, that's mostly quasi-experimental and theoretical basis for that. There's not a cluster randomized trial that's ever shown that to be the case, but that's okay. But then the new message is, of course, masks may protect me to some degree by getting a lower inoculum dose. But of course, that message has been labeled by some mask proponents as dangerous. This is a disaster that would have been solved with just some brutal honesty, which is, look, buddy, we don't got the perfect study. All this data, it's flawed, it's circumstantial, it's not the perfect data. I can't say for sure, but let's just do it. Let's shut up about it and do it. We got to suck up and do some things. The alternative is these people might want to close everything down. Let's just put this on. Let's get out there. Let's go do some stuff. That's the America I know. You just say that and people would be on board.
Completely. I think this is why, I remember growing up, and I think Ronald Reagan was a master of this. He was persuasive, and he had really a kind, humble spirit about him. And I think this, the worst thing we can do is use crappy studies to persuade. But the second worst thing we can do is be mean about it. I mean, I just think meanness is so unpersuasive and so divisive. It just doesn't work. And I read some people with really good arguments and really good skepticisms who are just mean, and just that doesn't work, because people don't respond to that. Yeah. And I think it's just wrong. So I'm not for it. I just try. You know, the funny thing that about Twitter is the more people are mean to me, the more it makes me less mean. I just almost never get aggravated. It almost makes me like, I don't know what it is. It's weird. It's like church. I feel like I see it and I think that is the stupidest way to make an argument, and you're just hurting yourself. And so we can't interact with all these people. You can't change the world by interacting with everybody on Twitter. All you can do is try and make the best case for persuasiveness.
You know, it's funny because you really do it nicely, which is that they punch you and then you just go super nice back, and then they punch one more time, super nice back, and then people watch it and they're just like, come on, man, Mandrola's a good guy, you know, you're totally out of line, and it just flips the whole audience to your side. I mean, you're just crushing them with kindness. And they reveal themselves to be fools because, like, why are they getting you so mad at you for having this, you know, middle of the road opinion?
Yeah, I get plenty mad at certain things. I mean, I'm not known for my calmness at work, and I get aggravated pretty easy. But for whatever reason, when I see that and they're attacking me, I don't feel like it's worth responding.
I think the forum has changed a lot in the last 5 years. I mean, I remember 5 years ago, I found it more fun. It was more fun. It was less judgy. It was less shame, or the goal, you know, there are fewer people cruising for the daily dose of shaming someone, the daily dose of outrage. It was more, you know, Mandrola would say, you know, we shouldn't be putting in Watchmen's, and there'd be somebody who's on the take from Watchmen saying you ought to put him in, and they'd be me saying like, oh, does everyone really need Avastin? And there'd be somebody who's, you know, stuffing their pockets with Genentech money saying you ought to give more Avastin. You know, it was the good old days where we'd argue about some drug, some device, some procedure, some screening test. And there was a little back and forth. There was a little bit of, you know, there's a little meanness there, but you know, it was 9 verse 2, 2 verse 7, you know, that kind of like little playground spat. And then it would end, and then, you know, people forget a little bit, and it felt ephemeral. It felt like not real, felt like the internet. And now it's, you know, 10,000 people think some paper in Vascular Surgery Journal is a sort of a misogynistic paper, and that the first author maybe he should kill himself. I mean, I don't know. I mean, they keep taunting him like that with 300 things in his thread, and you know, I don't know what they want him to do. He's apologized, but it's not, of course, an apology on the internet is never. You know, the day there's a good apology on the internet, you know, we're gonna have to halt the presses. It'll be like a solar eclipse or something. I mean, it's never a perfect apology on the internet. You know, it's just this sea of like, what's the newest thing to mob about, the newest thing to be outraged about. It's not the same. And it's not, and you know, every single person who I know from like 5 years ago who used to like it, like, you know, I was talking to Chadi recently. You and I were talking to Chadi, and you know, he doesn't have his heart in it the same way. Saurabh Jha doesn't have his heart in it the same way. And a lot of people don't have it. It's just, it's cooled. I mean, it's not the same.
Well, it isn't the same. Things change, and I agree that it's not a good platform for arguing, and there is mob Twitter, and that's a negative. But I still find it just, you know, enthralling, because I follow super left people and super right people, and I literally have the same number of them, and I read. You know, I read Jeet here, and, you know, I read Barry Weiss, and I read Scott Adams, and I read both sides, and I think it's really fun that way. As far as medicine, there's still good things in medicine coming out of it. But I think it's not, you can't just use Twitter And this is where it used to be back in the day. It was the blogs, right? We could write blogs, but now no one reads. So now it's podcasts, and it's long form podcasting. And I may be wrong about this, but I think long form podcasting allows these more nuanced conversations and really, I think, stand a chance to save us in terms of, bridging some of these gaps. And I mean, look at Joe Rogan. I listened to a podcast the other day. He said he told somebody he had 100 million downloads a month.
Really?
I mean,
jeez.
Eric Weinstein. I mean, there's just people having these long conversations that are, I think, amazing. And so I'm a big fan of long form podcasting, but I'm also a fan of Twitter for what it is. But I'm not fantasizing about what it was, because it's definitely different.
It's definitely different. And you listen to Rogan then. So Rogan has said many times that he does not look at Twitter. It's a dumpster fire. He recently had a discussant who I listened to, 3-hour discussion about the way social media companies are trying to hijack your attention, which is the basis of the documentary on Netflix. But, in some quarters, you might even be branded a supremacist for acknowledging that you listen to that podcast occasionally.
Yeah, but I mean, Rogan's a funny character because he has left-leaning political views, but is not culturally in line with people. I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying that Joe Rogan is, the best or whatever, but I listen to him. I don't listen to every single one, but I mean, I think he doesn't have 100 million downloads a month for nothing. I mean, he has people on there, and he's not afraid to say certain things. And, so I listen to a lot of I listen to left and I listen to, right podcasts. I think it's the way to go.
I listen to some Joe Rogan, but always by accident. No. No, but that's what President Trump says about Bill Maher's show. He said, I saw this comedian Bill Maher by accident. He's like, how do you watch my show every week by accident? Somebody had it on, you just keep watching it. But I listen to Joe Rogan a lot, and I think that, and I've also listened to the criticism, and I've definitely listened to some episodes where I want to strangle Joe. I've also listened to some episodes where I wanted to give him a prize. And why do I feel that way? I mean, I think he's somebody who is not easily put in a box. His views are not easily captured in a box. I mean, I think people can inappropriately put him in a box, but he's not easily sort of captured. He's certainly not part of the culture of the left. He certainly has a lot of political views that align with the left. But what I find him to be really good at is every once in a while he has a guest on where he just doesn't know anything about that space. Like, it could be Brian Greene and planetary things. It could be Neil deGrasse Tyson and, astrophysics, or I don't know, whatever. Something he just doesn't know anything about. And I swear to God, this guy asks, just earnest questions, trying to figure out, what's going on. And he's damn good at it. He's damn good at just being an earnest questioner. And that's why you can listen for 3 hours and learn a lot.
Right. It's like he's he just sort of Tyler Cowen has this too.
Yeah.
I mean, he just is interested in everything, and maybe not an expert in anything, but really, yeah. And I love the curiosity, and I agree. It's almost like B students make better teachers, because if you're an A student, you understand everything so perfectly well. And he's just trying to understand it on his level, and I think that's what. He's on a level that a lot of people are on. And, so I mean, the guy had Bernie Sanders on. Yeah. Come on. Didn't he endorse Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, he endorsed Bernie.
Yeah. So, I mean, how can you call him right wing if he's endorsing Bernie? Right, it's just, it's not consistent. Yeah. I think it was Blaise Pascal said, that thinking clearly was basically all like a morality, right thinking is what we have, and that, I guess that's what I shoot for.
That
Hitchens,
is,
I think too.
Yes.
Hitchens always said that there was time spent in argument is almost never time spent wasted, and so I mean there's just value in this, and we ought to be able to have these discussions. What Pascal's quote was great. He said, "All of our dignity consists in thought. It is by this that we must raise ourselves up. Let us work, therefore, to think well, for such is the principle of morality. I mean, that is just, to me, it's just classic. All of our dignity consists in thought. And I mean, this is what we need more of, and this is why I write and why I podcast and why I'm engaged, is that I don't have the answers, but gosh, we ought to be able to have a discussion about the pros and cons and benefits and risks and all of this business.
Yeah, I mean, that's my view of science, which is that if you want to say you're a scientist, I know these days it's fashionable to say, I'm with science, I'm with the scientists. But many of the people who say that, they don't meet my definition of scientist. Being a scientist means that you have to call out bad studies, bad methodology, bad reasoning, even if it goes in the direction you like. You got to call it out. And there have been many studies that I personally abandoned, wouldn't put my name on, I didn't want to participate in, if they are not robust. In fact, I don't know. I mean, I could say it would tarnish my legacy. I don't even know if I have a legacy, because probably like most people, when I die, no one will. No, first, I know what'll happen when I die. When I die, there's just going to be like 100 tweets that say, "Oh gosh, I always loved him," by people who always hated me. You know, that kind of.
Well, they'll probably say,
classic
they'll
bullshit.
Probably say
classic
you should have taken that chemo drug, that genomic drug.
Yeah, that would have cured him. Yeah. And so first they'd be that whole like, oh, I always was a big fan, and it would be like the person who was like my number one enemy and like complaining to my boss about me. So there would be that, and then of course, like everyone else, I would just be quickly forgotten, which is the fate of most people. That said, even though I would be quickly forgotten, I would not be able to live with myself if I was the author of serial garbage. I mean, that's just not my view of science. My other view of science is that if our science comms, that's another popular topic these days, because there's a lot of people who are in the science comm business, and they say that what is it? If we don't step into this space, who will? Who will go on CNN and tell these people on CNN what's up with COVID in 1 minute? The 1 minute summary with no nuance and no trade-offs about COVID. And I would say that many of the people who are commenting, they don't have primary familiarity with the data. They are not inserting needed nuance and caveats and needed uncertainty. And it's almost always is like, what is the masques du jour? What is the thing we're going to beat on about today? And it's always a new thing. More testing today, and then we got to do this, we got to do that, we got to test, trace, isolate. I was like, yeah, you got to think through that recommendation a bit, because it's quite feasible when there are very few cases. When there are lots of cases and there is no resource to do that, and people don't want to tell you who they talked to or visited, it is not so easy to do, is it? It's not so easy to do. And I got really annoyed when I looked at these memos, these stupid memos. I got really annoyed because I'm like, one memo, I thought the Great Barrington, let's be honest, you know, it's a counter memo to the culture. It's a counterculture memo that says, you know, many of you want to lock everything down and keep every schools closed for forever until there's a vaccine. You know, there's a downside to that. In fact, a lot of young people could get this infection and they'd be fine. And then there's the response memo, and the response memo was like, well, no, we got to do whatever it takes until keep things shut down, and immunity might vanish. We don't even know if it'll vanish the next day. It had all these kind of fear mongering about vanishing immunity. And people faulted the Great Barrington Declaration, and I think even rightly, for not really explaining, like, you know, how do you protect the vulnerable? Are you just going to tell somebody who's like, if you're 45 or 55, what's the cutoff? And you have to go sequester in your bunker? Or if you're 40 with diabetes, I mean, is it going to have like a Chad's 2 Vask scale? I mean, it's going to have some scale, and the net result is you either go in a bunker or you go party. I mean, is that how it works? Or like they didn't have a fleshed out plan. Fair enough. But the people in the other declaration, they were like, oh, well, we're going to do all these things. And then I'm like, well, you know, there's a lot of poor people who are living like paycheck to paycheck. There's food insecurity. People don't have enough food in the Bay Area, in San Francisco area. Their surveys suggest some people are going hungry. How are you going to solve that problem? And they're like, oh, well, economists should come up with a stimulus package. That's just the same. It's just another hand waving. These people are hand waving how you protect the old, and you're just hand waving how you're going to protect the vulnerable from economic collapse. It's just hand waving. That's not an answer. If I'm hungry today and you say economists should work on this, I'm going to be really pissed with you because that's not a really answer for my hunger. So, I forget where I was going with this. I think it is to say that many of the people who comment extensively on COVID are living in a fantasy world that's disconnected. They're not willing to talk to people who have other points of view, and they're not willing to concede that there are challenges that they haven't thought through in their own little worldview. Thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's the same thing I feel about scientific studies. I think all studies, the abstract ought to have a bolded paragraph about the limitations, so everybody can just read the limitations first. It's not bad for science. We have to respect the null hypothesis. We don't. I mean, science. This is a hard problem. How to deal with COVID is a super hard problem because the virus is terrible. It's terrible. It's highly infectious, and it affects vulnerable people, but it also every once in a while affects people who aren't so vulnerable. So it's a terrible virus. I hate it. But man, if you see patients who are, not in a city, if you see people like working people like I do, I mean, people are hurting, and it just, the whole San Francisco thing gets to me a little bit because San Francisco's bragging about how great they're doing. Well, I mean, I know there's poor people in San Francisco, but a lot of people in San Francisco have the benefit of just getting on Zoom and working remotely, whereas people in other parts of the country, they're getting hammered. Like, I think it was South Dakota. Wayne Toaster Pastry was tweeting that, South Dakota has a huge meatpacking plant. They just can't shut down. You just can't go Zoom and have, meat. So I don't know. I think if we had a better political environment, a person like Fauci could get up to the podium, and he actually, I think, could address some of this nuance and say, look, we're not really sure about these best practices, but here's our best guess. And the American people would just eat that up, I think, because they know people know that this is a hard problem, and I think they're just many are just repulsed by this binary thinking. If you think we should open up schools, or we think we should whatever, you're just a killer. I mean, that's like calling people racist that aren't racist.
Exactly.
It's
poison. It's poison, and it's self-defeating, and that's why you running against the worst person who's ever done this job in the history of the Republic, and you're biting your nails 4 days later to see if you still won. I mean, you would. That's a part of why. The thing you're talking about, which I'll tell listeners about, which I thought was one of those long threads. Something about lockdowns and reopening the economy. They're not antagonistic. We can have our cake and eat it too. Just look at how San Francisco did. And the more I looked at the thread, I was like, I wanted to bang my head against a wall, because I'm like, well, San Francisco, they can't extrapolate from San Francisco. There's a few reasons why. One, it probably has one of the largest workforces that does not have to show up physically for work. Two, many of the people who are part of said workforce immediately vacated to go live in their parents' house or their other home or whatever. It has tremendous affluence, so much affluence that such a huge chunk of this city can pull itself out from circulation. It has a certain type of climate. Who knows to what degree that would contribute? Even asking that question is once heretical. That, I think Stefan Baral, he went on some news show and said that there is seasonality to coronavirus, and he almost got, his head bit off for saying that. That is one factor amongst many to explain the circulation of viruses like this. But it has a number of these things that aren't really readily extrapolatable to other places. And the irony, of course, is that it's easy for the coastal elite to ask why the meatpacking plant is open in South Dakota while they themselves order meat through Uber Eats to have delivered to their house, which is, a great irony. But it is part of some of the tone deaf, I think, threads that sort of don't seem to appreciate the different circumstances around this country. I was asked by a reporter recently, under what circumstances do I think we should reinstitute lockdowns in the fall? And my answer was, I was like, what are you talking about? Because I was like, a policy like lockdowns, it certainly has theoretical benefits to slow the spread of the virus, but it has a real downside. And if you do it in a country that is incredibly politically divided, where a lot of people don't want to do it, I think it may blow up in your face very badly. And so I would say that sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good, and you may not be able to do it at all because people are not there. And certainly when I call my high school friends who live in Kentucky, who I grew up with in Indiana, and I get a sense of how people feel, I'm like, I don't think that's going to go over so well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, Vinay, I'm just struck by, I don't even think it's just tone deaf. I think that, sometimes I wonder, these people who are super smart, sometimes don't show to me that they have any sense of
EQ.
Or what, more than just EQ, but what normal people, normal people think, you're exactly right. I mean, it's a complex thing. It's, you just can't say, you can't treat America like it's New Zealand. I mean, I just don't, maybe I'll get in trouble for saying that. And New Zealand's great. I mean, they can close their borders and they have, they can just do what they do. And we're a big, rambunctious, diverse, heterogeneous country. And it's, you gotta, I think Steph said it so well. He said, public health is about the public health that you can do, not the public health you want. And it's just like medicine. I mean, I'd like everybody to take their medicines perfectly. I'd like everybody to exercise and eat right and not smoke. But, people do those things, and we still take care of them, and it's just is what it is. And, you want it to be better, and you try and persuade people to lose weight, you try and persuade people to wear masks and not go to bars. But, you can only do so much.
You can't say it is what it is. That's what he says. that's what Charles.
Sorry. It is what it is. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. No, I'm not a Trumper.
No.
Oh my God.
Secret. You're betraying yourself. No. I guess I would say I agree with you. And one of the things as a clinician that many years ago I went to some lecture, and the speaker was talking about how if you have a patient with extended stage small cell lung cancer, you should encourage them to quit smoking and that sort of thing. And then I was like, I don't know how to put this to you politely, but, I have a lot of sympathy for someone in that situation. And I think it is quite likely, possible, maybe probable, that prior smoking contributed to the extended stage small cell lung cancer. I also recognize the median survival is on the order of 4-6 months. Back then, at least, maybe it was closer to 4 months. And if somebody doesn't want to quit smoking, you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to say anything because they have 4 months to live. And if they quit smoking, I suspect they would also have 4 months to live. So I suspect that getting them to quit smoking, I see, has no value at all in such a situation. And this person said, oh no, there's retrospective data that says people who quit smoking in that situation do better. And I was like, yeah, that's obviously flawed, deeply flawed retrospective data by the types of people who would quit in such a situation and the types who would continue and press on. And so I think I would put no stock at all whatsoever in that data. And this person didn't understand, but this person wasn't a clinician. They don't spend time with people. And I thought to myself, this person is a smart person with a grant funding, works at a premier institution, and does not understand that this is not something that a good doctor would even do. To take somebody who's dying and get them to quit smoking. In fact, I don't want to be too provocative, but one could argue that they can enjoy every cigarette in what little life they enjoy, whatever they want in that little life.
That's not provocative. That's just true wisdom.
Common sense. Yeah.
I do that all the time. I can't tell you, one of my most common lines is when, people come to me in their mid 80s or whatever, and they don't want to take a statin or whatever, their blood pressure med. I'm like, the point of preventive medicines is to get to 85.
Yes.
Once you're at 85, that's right, if you're a male, you're like, 7 years to the good, have fun. Don't do stupid stuff, but I don't know. To me, common sense would go a long way. And the common sense with COVID in America is that, we have to do the public health that's going to work for America, not for and not the public health that's going to work for Germany or Canada or wherever.
I wish we had sort of this conversation back in like March, Now I don't know where we are. I mean, I think we're in a situation where there's still going to be those public health zealots on Twitter, the Twitter public health zealots who don't have boots on the ground public health experience, but have theoretical experience with Excel spreadsheets. And they're going to say that you ought to do X, Y, and Z in a world disconnected from real people, where real people don't want to do those things. As you say, without sort of a finger on the pulse of what the average person wants to do. I think we're going to have a lame duck session that doesn't want to do anything. And I think it's going to be just a strange situation.
Well, I guess, Vinay, I'd say that these, it's just, to me, another irony of the thing is that people who speak about inequities and differences and outcomes, some voices are actually the loudest for lockdowns or restrictions, but the restrictions actually enhance these
inequities.
Inequities, and so it's like it's not right thinking. It's wrong thinking, and so I'm struck by the irony of it.
Yeah, I guess I'm struck by that as well. And I put myself in the progressive camp, and why do I put myself in that camp, even though I increasingly feel frustrated by, I think, progressive messaging that's self-defeating. But I put myself in that camp because I believe that one can enact a set of governmental policies that do improve outcomes for everybody, not just the wealthy amongst us, but improves outcomes for poor people, for minorities, for people who have historically been discriminated against. I think we can have that as a government. And I view progressivism as sort of the idea that governments should be free to experiment to improve these aims, and that we ought not tie our hands together and say, oh, well, we could never send a check to people and give them money. Well, if that works, well, that works, If that works, that works. Where I disagree with progressivism as it is defined in this modern age is I disagree with the idea that you get mileage out of shaming people and making people feel bad who are already on your side. I think that you gain mileage when you bring more people into your tent so you have more political clout. So that's one of the points of disagreement I have. I get frustrated with people who prioritize plans over empiricism. So if your plan is Medicare for all, and it turns out that, that works well in Sweden but doesn't work so well here. If your plan is lift up all the drawbridges, and that works well in New Zealand and Ireland, but that doesn't work so well here, I get very frustrated because progressivism to me means pragmatism. It means trying things, and if they don't work, you have to abandon it and not live in your fairy tale world. And New Zealand, everyone is celebrating, but you and I are wise in one sense, where we point out this is mile marker 7 in a marathon. It's not done yet. And New Zealand may be looking good now, but what are they going to do with the vaccine? Let's say the vaccine comes out with a point estimate of efficacy of 40%. That ain't 100%. And you can't keep those drawbridges up forever unless you want to remain an island nation that has no tourism and starves itself on that island. You're going to have to lower those drawbridges. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen to Sweden in the future? It's easy to judge them. But it's still in the middle of the race, and I would be hesitant to do so. I think they have shown a prioritization for progressive values, the irony being they are a progressive nation. They believe that the children's education and their upward mobility is of tantamount importance in a society, and that we ought not compromise that, even if it means incurring higher casualties in the short term. That's a progressive choice that progressives have forgotten, and they want to demonize. And so I think demonization, taking people who are centrist and wanting to build a wall between you and the center, that's not progressivism. That's self-defeating. You're never going to get a coalition. And I think progressivism really is the idea that government intervention can do good with the right policy. And that's why I put myself firmly in that camp, because everything I do is about how we can do better drug discovery, drug development policy.
Right. You were smart to have Margaret McCartney on, because I think one of the things that we could do and should do and should advocate for is more is collecting data and looking at these natural experiments and these cluster randomized trials and learn from it. So yeah, I mean, randomized controlled trials aren't everything, but I mean, we could really use some experimentation in this space, especially with schools, different kinds of social distancing policies. I mean, why not?
Yeah, it would have gone a long way. But and that's another, I think, difference because these policies took on sort of an identity of their own. They came to define people who were part of us versus them. And so suddenly, if you were opposed to the policy, you were them. And if you were for testing the policy, you were them too. You weren't us. And so us are the people, we're the ones who want to do all the things, whether they work or not, who knows? That's for future pandemics. 2320, they'll figure that out then. We're going to figure out this century. We'll figure it out in the future century. I think when they look back in 2310 on this pandemic, they will put us much closer to the people who dealt with the bubonic plague than they will put us in the Society of Scientists.
Indeed.
Last question for you. This is something that I tweeted about recently. I wanted to pick your brain on it. There are a number of advocates in the COVID space who have pointed out that we should judge COVID expertise by the number of peer-reviewed publications someone has. And when I saw that claim, I thought, oh my God, I thought, oh boy, here we go again. The number of peer-reviewed publications. The other thing I hear is that Scott Atlas is no good because he's He's a radiologist. There's that writer for The Atlantic, I forget her name. She's a computer scientist, and she had written about masks a little bit ahead of the curve. She writes some things. Nobody ever says to her that she's not a doctor. They just say that she's a prophet. She is somebody who really understands uncertainty. But Scott Atlas, he's a moron because he's a radiologist. This is a very dumb way to look at the world. You're only saying that because you don't like what he says. You like what she says, so you're praising her. It's not about the credential. You need to explain what you don't like about their position. Similarly, if we live in an environment where 90% of academics believe we ought to have lockdowns and close schools and all these things, and somebody says we ought not to do those have serious downsides that may exceed benefits. If you say, why have you not published a peer-reviewed paper? It's really like sitting on someone's chest and asking why they're not standing up. The reason they're not publishing the peer-reviewed paper is it's got to go through people like you who don't agree with it. It's very difficult to publish a minority view peer-reviewed paper in a tight time frame because this has only been going on a few months. With enough years, it'll squeak through eventually. And as somebody who's written blogs that are outside of the traditional publication, and as somebody who's published in the traditional publication, I wonder if you might talk about, strengths, weaknesses, peer review. Is it necessary? Is it good? Just because you have it doesn't mean it's true? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that context expertise is worthwhile. For sure, context expertise is important. But, like, let's say you're writing a paper about cancer. Clearly, context expertise is important. Same with AFib, anticoagulation, fine. You need that. But, as we wrote in the medical conservative paper, context expertise is not everything. You need external eyes on something, and take this whole, pandemic. Who one person has contact expertise on a virus? So you have virologists, they know about the virus. You have infectious disease doctors, they know about that. You have ICU docs, ER docs surely have some context expertise. Epidemiologists, for sure. Economists, yes. But if you think about the virus and the interventions, there's no real one expert on this. That's number one. So I think it's total malarkey to think that you have to have a lot of peer-reviewed papers to have a worthwhile opinion. I mean, it's complete malarkey because of the pandemic. Second, I have to be careful what I say.
That's how I feel.
I'm writing with a group of authors some two papers on COVID. Let's say meta research. We're writing about meta research, and they're pretty. I mean, I'm biased. They're pretty well done papers, and they're not a flattering. The findings are not flattering to the adjudication of COVID science, and we are having a bear of a time getting it published. And so, if you have, and this is, it shouldn't be like this. It shouldn't be that science ought to be judged not by its narrative, but it just is very, very difficult. And there's no perfect peer review, but this insular peer review is, and I'm not the only one to say this. I mean, this has been out there. It's a real problem. It's a real problem.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, I think I just got my 270th peer review paper accepted. And I've been doing it for 11 years or something like that. And I can promise you that, the ideas that have the hardest uphill battle are not because the methods are any weaker than the other ones. It's because the ideas are the most against the grain of what vested interests think. And so if you want to publish a paper saying that the standards for publishing COVID articles are in the toilet, which is my guess what your paper found. I think I saw you because you tweeted a preprint about it. That they're publishing them fast and what
right.
their standard is poor.
That's one of them.
That's one of the. Oh, I see. Okay, and it's going to face an uphill battle because the people who are the gatekeeper of the message are the victim of the criticism of the message, and so they're not going to want to be, putting that out there rapidly.
Well, what do you think would have happened to that mass study? Say if it was one of those 1 out of 20 studies that found a positive p-value, and there was actually a difference in saturations wearing a mask, and it might just have been spurious, and they tried to publish that. Do you think that had any chance of getting published?
I think it's the problem is even worse than that. That as they were doing the study, if they found a significant reduction in SpO2 from wearing the mask, they will repeat the measurements until they do not find it. Exactly right. It's a bias susceptible endpoint. If this is how they run let's how they run the study. This is the run the study. They're like, oh my God, all these people who are wrong are saying this lowers O2. That's their starting point. We need to show these imbeciles that they are wrong. We're going to take people, measure the O2, put the mask on, measure the O2 again, and see what it is. That's the goal of the study. So they measure the O2, 96%. They measure it again, 94.2. Oh, that's lower. Let's give it a second. Let's check it again in a minute. It must be loose. They fix it, 96.2, correct. And they just do that. I mean, literally, it's not even science. They know what they want to find. They want to show these people are idiots. And so they're just going to find it. And it's the exact same thing that Daryl pointed out with simplicity, with renal artery denervation. They had the renal artery denervation. They put the cycle of the cuff. It's 160/90. And, they just had it. They can't be 160/90. Let's cycle it again. It's exactly the same thing, except the only difference is this time they really, really, really know what they want to find. And so it doesn't prove anything. And I don't know. And where does it stop? We're going to do ABGs on people. We're going to, and what delusion, who is there a delusion so crazy that we can say like, oh God, we can't test that. If somebody believes that, if they, I don't know. I mean, if people think that it changes your PET imaging, it has masks increase glucose uptake in your ears. Should I have to do 100-person the PET imaging study to prove that? This is crazy. We can't play this game. We got real stuff to do. I think this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen.
This is why critical appraisal is so important. A quick story. When many years ago, I was doing a poster on AFib ablation. And I had this theory that women did worse with AFib ablation, and I was looking at our series, and it turned out in our data set, it didn't show that it wasn't statistically significant. Mm-hmm. And I had hired this statistician. He was about 19 years old, and he was a sophomore statistician dude. Uh-huh. And he was like the littlest, humblest guy. And I said, okay, Sean, I know what we're going to do. We'll just look at women over 65. And I said, let's do it that way. And he looked at me with this blank face. And I said, what's the matter, Sean? Speak up. And he goes, you really can't do that. And I said, wait, I'm a cardiologist. It makes perfect sense. Let's do that. Yeah. And so I called my friend who's an academic, and he said, no, John. He goes, Sean is right. You can't do that. Yeah. But I mean, this is like routine stuff that we see every week with this, just looking for positive values. And so we need to be critical appraisal. I mean, we just need to keep doing it.
Exactly right. Well, John Mandrola, it's a pleasure to chat with you. The battery on my laptop is 4%, so I better wrap this up. I agree with you that podcast is the only antidote to Twitter. And I hope people who even disagree with us find the discussion illuminating, because at the end of the day, I think we are all more on the same side of the issue than folks recognize. One of the concerns, I think one of the problems we have with illiberalism is that we think it hurts the cause. Folks like you and I who want to see substantive addressment of socioeconomic disparities, who want more green space, more bike lanes, more better education, better nutrition for kids, for poor kids, who want more upward mobility, who want healthcare for everybody that's affordable. Folks like us who want those things, we feel like the far extreme views in our own group are making it harder for us to achieve our goals in our lifetime. And that's why we're critical of it, and that's why it bothers us. And I think that's why, we talked about it on this podcast the way we did.
Well, I completely agree. I'm honored that you had me on, and I really want to compliment you. I think Plenary Session is one of the best medical podcasts. I listen to it every week, and I just applaud everything that you do, and you should know that you should just keep doing it, and it's just fantastic. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mandrola. You've been listening to Season 3 of Plenary Session. Plenary Session is produced by Kiana Klossner. Music by Ian Straley and Audrey Tran. The views expressed on Plenary Session are those of whoever said it and no one else. Plenary Session is not medical advice. Follow us on Twitter at plenary_session. Until next time.